Wally, a game about walking around, throwing cubes, and solving puzzles. Many of these puzzles tend to require you to jump. Like, a lot of them. So this begs the question, can we beat level 1 without jumping at all? Now, before we get into things, we need to cover some basics on movement in Wally first. You can move Wally around using the left joystick, which is currently in the upwards position at the moment. You can jump by pressing the A button. To those still unaware, this isn't a particularly alluring option. You can pick up or create cubes by pressing the B button, and you could throw the cubes by pressing the right trigger. The purpose of making and throwing cubes will become apparent shortly. Originally, how many A presses were there? What kind of obstacles were there to overcome? Now, obviously, we're not going to go through the entirety of level 1 and analyze every single place where there was. Oh, of course we are. We start off level 1 with nothing better to do than to follow the cockroach. We then make it to this spot where we get introduced to our first cutscene. In Wally, there are 3 types of cutscenes, these being full, strong, and weak. Full and strong cutscenes take away player control. Weak cutscenes, however, don't take away player control. In a full cutscene, no buttons can be pressed. In a strong cutscene, an escape button may need to be pressed. During a weak cutscene, any button can be pressed. A strong cutscene may end by itself, however sometimes an A press is required to end it. Full cutscenes are like movie scenes, while strong cutscenes have text or tutorial the game wants you to read. Weak cutscenes are background decoration for the purpose of aesthetic. Here we see Wally take damage as the screen shakes and that sign falls down in the background. This is simple decoration designed to portray how rundown and broken the world is. However, it does real damage to the Wally character. We then come across this. This is a pipe wall, and when you jump over it, it's called a pipe jump. Pipe jumps are the most basic and common A press in the entire A button challenge, which is why they were given their own special name. Speaking of, this marks our first A press, which I will keep track of in the upper right corner of the screen. We then reach our next A press, which is yet another pipe jump, before embarking on possibly our most formidable foe of the entire A button challenge, a cutscene A press. But more on that later. We pass by this checkpoint which saves our game before entering the cutscene. But after we press A to exit the cutscene, we are then free to continue on with the level. We traverse around these death pits before entering another strong cutscene. This one's nice as it doesn't require an A press. Then we jump over this gap. We then jump over this pipe wall and head to the next cutscene. This is a strong cutscene that also requires an A press to escape. After picking up a cube, another strong cutscene plays that also requires an escape A press. After throwing the cube at the target, a strong cutscene will play, which removes this barrier. We then throw a cube at this target, allowing us to reach the upper area. This brings us to a strong cutscene that teaches us how to use B&L vending stations. We then pick up the vending station repair item, which brings us to another strong cutscene. These B&L vending station repair items must be collected so that they can be inserted into the vending stations. This allows the vending stations to dispense cubes. After inserting this one, a strong cutscene plays and teaches us how to get cubes from vending stations. We then get 2 trash cubes, which we use to throw at these 2 targets which lower the bridges. This allows us to get across. We pick up another B&L station repair item along the way. This item goes in this vending station. When you get near it, a strong cutscene plays that teaches you what heavy cubes are. I probably should go over what the different types of cubes are. In Wally, there are 5 types of cubes, these being the normal cube, the gray cube, the explosion cube, the electricity cube, and the magnet cube. Normal cubes, or trash cubes, can be obtained from trash piles, or from trash cube dispensing vending stations, as seen before. They can then be thrown in a straightward direction at targets or to destroy obstacles. Gray cubes, or heavy cubes, can be obtained from vending stations. They can then be thrown into buckets as they weigh more than regular cubes. They will weigh the bucket down, and it will activate some trigger. Explosion cubes are very rare in the main game. As far as I know, the only place they exist is the first level. Explosion cubes are a weapon in multiplayer mode. Explosion cubes explode on impact. This explosion knocks Wally back and deals 4 damage. The explosion of an explosion cube has 2 parts. The initial explosion on impact. A second later, a bunch of explosions preceding it. We'll get to the electricity cube later, and the magnet cube we will not address because it does not appear in level 1. Throwing the gray cube into the bucket will activate this gate to open. After grabbing 2 more gray cubes, we head over to yet another pipe wall. We throw our gray cubes over the pipe wall, and then we jump over it. We then grab the gray cubes and throw them into a bucket. This bucket is a little different as 2 of its lights are originally off. This means that 2 gray cubes will be required for it to activate. Pipe wall, pipe jump. We use the trash pile to acquire a cube, which we will use to throw at this target in a moment. This target will activate the ramp to raise, allowing us to reach these swinging platforms. We then jump into this rotating tube, and then make sure we do not fall through any of the holes. After making our way to this platform with the save checkpoint, we grab a trash cube and throw it at the target. This will activate the Ferris wheel, allowing us to get to the other side. We then use the trash pile to get 3 normal cubes. We will use these 3 normal cubes to throw at the target. Each time we throw a normal cube at the target, the platform under Wally will move forward. We are then introduced to our first tumbler. This is a very small tumbler, however it is still a tumbler. Tumblers allow you to select which side of it you would like to traverse, using the tumbler controls.
Interestingly, this is not an A press. The game forces Wally to jump without us pressing the A button. There are many instances where the game makes Wally jump without us having to press A. These become useful later. We then throw 2 heavy cubes into this bucket. Then 2 strong cutscenes play right after each other. After taking this ramp down, we encounter our first full cutscene. After encountering the save checkpoint, we head over to another pipe jump. This one's a little different because it has debris on the other side. We then head over here to 2 swinging platforms. We get on one swinging platform, then jump this gap to the other one, and then leave the other swinging platform. We then jump onto this island bit, grab the B&L vending station repair item, jump off the middle island, then jump into this tube, dodge the holes, and then leave the tube. We then jump onto this flap on the ground, which will throw Wally onto the higher ledge. We then put the item into the vending station, allowing us to get gray cubes. Two gray cubes were needed to weigh down the bucket. This reveals another target which needs to be hit by a trash cube. This will cause the middle island to rotate, allowing us to get across with 2 more jumps. We then reach a save checkpoint, and a cutscene plays. This is another strong cutscene that does not require an A press, thankfully. Another feature of this game is how Wally can use his cube form to jump into objects to either break them or push them around like this blue box. Remember how later I said we would go over electricity cubes? Well, now is later. When an electric cube is next to a charge-up pylon, it slowly charges up. When the pylon is fully charged, it triggers some sort of event. Electric cubes physically behave very similar to normal cubes. Speaking of, let's go over the trajectories of normal cubes and gray cubes. When Wally throws a cube, the paths of a normal cube, electric cube, and magnet cube are different than the paths taken by heavy cubes and explosion cubes. Upon impact, trash cubes, electricity cubes, and magnet cubes will all immediately explode. Heavy cubes, upon impact, will take no damage and just bounce. Contrarily, explosion cubes on impact will also explode. While we're here, let's go over what happens when you leave a cube laying on the ground. Cubes naturally explode after being left on the ground too long. Trash cubes explode after approximately 28 seconds. Heavy cubes explode after approximately 58 seconds. Both electricity cubes and magnet cubes explode after approximately 6.3 seconds, and explosion cubes don't seem to ever explode. Here's a table that summarizes this data. You can pause to read it if you need more time. After the elevator makes it up, we charge up one more pylon that triggers a weak cutscene that eventually will allow us to leave the tower. This here is one giant two-halved tumbler, much like the one we saw before, except much bigger. Completing each half from each side, totaling 6 halves, unlocks a secret area. However, we will not be needing to visit these other sides. This would be a good time to discuss auto jumps. There are many situations where the game will make Wally jump for you. This means Wally will jump and go into cube form without pressing the A button. We saw this before with this hammer. The game automatically makes Wally jump and remain in cube form while the hammer hits him. It also happened at other points, however we were unaware. Here, because we jumped over the pipe wall, we don't notice that the game is also auto-jumping for us. If we were somehow able to make it over this pipe wall without jumping, we would see that the game auto-jumps for us. Usually the game will auto-jump you before going down a slick surface like the one shown above. Notice in both of these instances of an auto-jump, Wally is sliding down a slick surface. You will also notice that this cube form symbol is present when an auto-jump occurs. Here we go over a slick surface which causes an auto-jump. Each side has a pylon that needs to be charged. Charging 2 pylons total will allow us to leave the level. Charging all 6 unlocks the secret area, as I mentioned before. However, we only need to charge 2 to beat the level. This here was the pylon for this side of this half of the tumbler. This is where the 2 halves of the tumblers connect. After jumping into this wall to knock it over, we head down here where we can either get a new cube if we need one, or just re-grab our old one like we do here. We then head over here to this elevator. After charging this pylon, the elevator will raise, allowing us to reach the main pylon for this side of this tumbler. We then jump over this gap to make it to this area. We can then head over here to our final pipe wall, where we make one more jump, allowing us to end the level.
Now that we have our first count, time to get rid of some of these A presses. Now, I'm going to go in chronological order as much as possible. However, some A presses will be done out of chronological order, as it makes more sense to do the video in that way. In Wally, levels are broken up into pieces called areas. This is more important in the Wii version, where each area is ended by a save. However, in the Xbox 360 version, areas are just a concept that make things simpler. In level 1, there are 4 areas. On screen right now is Area 1. Now we move on to Area 2. Here we're going into Area 3. This tumbler portion is Area 4. These are all the areas in Level 1. On screen right now are the A presses associated with the various areas. As you can see, there aren't that many A presses in Area 2 or Area 4. We're going to start with Area 1. In particular, we're going to try to save this pipe jump. There isn't much we can do from the ground, it's simply a wall. And this is where one of our 3 basic strategies comes into play. Gaining height. The reason we would jump is to gain height. However, we can remedy this by gaining height in another way. This will allow us to skip this jump. One way we could do this is by gaining height using this path that goes to the secret. However, it is not that simple because this path requires 1, 2, 3, 4 jumps. And even then, this gap isn't passable without jumping. However, this is our best option.
If you stuff some cones into the corner like this, it can allow Wally to use them as a bridge going across. Doing this barely allows Wally to get across. So we know that this could save the A press, but there are still jumps that we have to do without pressing A for this to be possible. This bit of trash right here can act as a ramp for Wally to get up. However, to get past this step right here, we're going to need to introduce a new basic strategy. Just run into it. Let's say you need to get over an obstacle, however there's no way to gain height. Sometimes, you could just run right into the obstacle and Wally will get over it. This can work with both walls and gaps. To get past this step right here, all we do is run right into it and Wally makes it over. It's important to note that this only works in specific situations. The step itself can't be too high, and the geometry has to be just right, as well as the surface type. Here, we can use a cube to blow up this obstacle instead of jumping into it to get rid of it. We can get a cube from this trash pile over here. Now, this little step is another classic case of just run into it. And there you have it. It's possible to get all the way to the end of this shortcut without jumping, and therefore it's possible to get past the pipe wall without pressing A. Here, we have our second A press, another pipe jump. This pipe wall is not as tall as the previous one. As you can see, this pipe wall only has 2 pipes, while the previous one had 3. Now, there isn't any way to gain height like the last one. So we're going to need to use the last of our 3 basic strategies. Artificial stairs. Let's say we don't have access to a way to gain height, and the object we're trying to get over is too high to just run into. In this situation, we can use an object to act as a staircase to allow Wally to climb up and over the obstacle. Now, not all objects can be used as a staircase. Cones, for instance, are too tall for Wally to walk up onto. However, this does not mean cones cannot be used as a staircase. It just needs to be paired with another object to gain the initial height, to get on top of the cone. Another object that can be used to gain height is, a box of cremies. Also, I find it interesting that the cockroach's name is Hal. Just thought I'd point that out. Anyway, here's a picture of those boxes in-game. Now, Wally can indeed walk up onto these boxes, however, because they're so small, they don't offer much height gain. Tires are extremely useful as a staircase, as they offer a lot of height and Wally can walk up onto them by himself. The last of the 4 regular staircase objects are cubes. Wally can... one second. Let's try that again, but this time let's put a wall here. The cubes are just ever so slightly too tall to allow for Wally to walk up the cubes by himself. Something needs to be paired with the cubes to give Wally a bit of initial height before Wally can use them as a staircase. This is a primary example of when the situational run into it works and doesn't work. In a situation like the one shown on the left, Wally would not be able to use the cube as a staircase, as Wally would not be able to get onto the cube. Compare this to the situation on the right, Wally would indeed be able to use the cube as a staircase because the geometry sort of lifts Wally up onto the cube. However, keep in mind, this is extremely situational. The example shown to the right will not always work. However, there is a case where it does, and this is actually used to save an A-press in the future. Over here, there's a stack of tires. Since this pipe wall is so short, we can actually use the tires to get over it. As seen here, this Wally prop is not fully solid. To fix this, we will put one tire inside the Wally prop to act as a wall for the other one. This is not strictly necessary, but it makes the trick easier. The height of the tire alone ends up not actually being enough to get Wally over the pipe wall. Shown in the footage here, the tire actually becomes a mini ramp, allowing Wally to make it over the pipe wall. When Wally runs into the tire, it causes the back of the tire to run into the pipe wall. This tilts the tire upwards, turning it into a ramp, allowing Wally to gain a bit of extra height from both the height of the tire and the ramp. You can see in the footage here that the tire ever so slightly tilts up, and this is what allows Wally to make it over the pipe wall. We then come to this strong cutscene, specifically one that requires an A press to exit. Remember how I said we would talk about these later? Well, now is later. Introducing the arch enemy to the A button challenge, the cutscene A press. The reason that these A presses are so bad is because you can't do anything but press the pause button and the A button when you're in one. The only way to get out of one is to press the A button. Usually cutscene A presses are unavoidable, and you're left with no choice but to press the A button. Seeing as this is level 1, the tutorial level, there's a lot of these as well. Like, watch this. Seriously, there was no way to avoid collecting that. Oh, and guess what? In order to progress with the rest of this area, we need a cube. Put the repair item in the vending station to get a cube, and we get stuck in another unskippable cutscene. Cutscene A presses end up being the worst A presses out of the entire A button challenge, by far. Fittingly, our first one that we can't save on our first run through is a cutscene A press. We then come across this strong cutscene. Thankfully, this one does not require an A press to skip. So, there's a gap. Thankfully, the gap isn't that big. As you can see, the gap is around 4 cube Wallies long. First of all, we're going to try to use our most basic strategy. Unfortunately, the gap is just too long for this to work. And just barely too long. Wally can even grab the partial health, but just barely can't make it onto the ledge. Also note that in order to grab the partial health, Wally must also take a path that leads to him taking fall damage as well. Obviously, our other two strategies won't work either, leaving us with no basic strategies. However, there is sort of a fourth semi-basic honorary strategy: explosion cubes. Now, we are in a situation where we do not have access to our 3 basic strategies. We can use explosion cubes to potentially solve the problem. Using the blast from the explosion cube, we can gain a small amount of height or a large amount of distance. As shown in the footage before, the blast from an explosion cube can knock Wally back a very far distance. This distance being more than enough to clear this minuscule gap. However, due to the 2 weak cutscenes earlier, Wally only has 4 health left. The blast from an explosion cube does 4 damage and would immediately scrap Wally. But remember how we can just barely grab this partial health? We currently have 4 power, and the partial health gives us an additional 2. We then take 1 damage from the fall. Remember, this fall is required, as in my tens of attempts at performing this trick and variations of it, as well as studying the surrounding area, I have never grabbed the partial health without taking fall damage afterwards. After this is all said and done, this leaves Wally with 5 power. Notice that after these partial health and fall damage shenanigans, we are left with more power than we started. Having 4 power and getting hit by the blast from an explosion cube means bye-bye Wally. However, having 5 power and getting hit by a blast from an explosion cube means we can blast Wally across the gap and survive. Now, this is easier said than done because the blast of an explosion cube is possibly the most broken mechanic of Wally. However, with some luck, we can indeed successfully blast Wally across the gap and save the A-press. Notice in the footage, we have not grabbed the partial health yet. This is simply due to the footage I am showing you. The explosion from the cube is so dumb that I didn't even bother to record better footage. Hey, I already recorded like 2 hours of footage for this video, cut me a break. Anyway, just keep in mind that this footage is inaccurate and we would have already collected the partial health to allow Wally to survive the blast. We then arrive at another pipe wall. This pipe wall is interesting because this one will not be a walk in the park to save. There is nothing useful on this side, and the pipe wall is the regular decently tall height now. There is this box on the ground, however this box doesn't yield nearly enough height to allow Wally to get over the wall. This pile of decoration garbage on the right looks promising, like we could use it as a ramp to get over the pipe wall. However, in practice, Wally gets stuck and is not able to make it over the wall. Let's get a clear view of the environment. There seems to be a sort of dent hidden in the pile of trash. This dent causes Wally to get stuck inside and prevents us from using the trash pile as a way to get over the pipe wall. We must move on, as there seems to be no way over the pipe wall without jumping. Things don't get any better as we progress either, as we are confronted with another 6 A-presses with not much to say about, as they are just unskippable cutscene A-presses. We then make it to another pipe wall. We must first consider our basic strategies. Can we just run into it? No, this wouldn't cause Wally to run up it or anything else useful. What about a staircase of some sort? Well, there isn't anything around to make a staircase out of, and cubes won't work either, as when Wally runs into them, they just get knocked out the way, even if Wally was able to walk up the cube's height in the first place. Can we get height somehow? Well, there doesn't seem to be any higher area nearby. There is this pile of decoration garbage over here, but Wally cannot use this to gain height. What about blasting Wally over? Well, even if we were able to somehow bring an explosion cube all the way over here from the start of the level, there is no guarantee that it will work. And on my first run through of the game, this strategy was too advanced, so I decided to continue on and tackle simpler ones first. Here is the sort of boss fight of all pipe walls. Now I'll save us some time and tell you that there is nothing to run at, use as a staircase, use for height, and it's the same story with the explosion cube. This pile of garbage over here looks extremely promising, but in practice, there seems to be no way to use it to get over the pipe wall. In fact, you can see there seems to be some odd geometry in this area. Even with jumping, Wally isn't able to make it past this part of the pipe wall. As you can see, there seems to be a large invisible wall here. This wall is preventing Wally from jumping over the pipe wall in this area. This makes using the trash pile as a ramp to get over the pipe wall without jumping impossible, as the only way to get over this pipe wall would be to go around the invisible wall, which is just not possible from the ramp. With this being said, we must move on yet again. We slide down this slick surface, which obviously doesn't require any A-presses, and with that, we have made it out of Area 1. This puts Area 1 at a high 10 A-presses. Now, thankfully, Area 2 does not require nearly as many A-presses. In fact, we don't reach our first one until here. The only strategy that could possibly work here is our most basic one, and this one sadly doesn't work. I wanted to address this obstacle, even though it isn't an A-press. Speedrunners of this game usually jump these platforms to get across faster, which would incur 3 A presses. Since speed is not a concern, playing the game the intended way actually for once results in less A presses. Now there are 2 jumps on this tumbler. These 2 A press saves are beautifully simple. Just spin the tumbler to the 3rd side, revealing the completely flat path. Thankfully this path exists, else I have no clue what we would have done here. With that being said, this leaves only 1 single A press in the entirety of Area 2. Here comes another pipe wall, but don't worry, this one is easy this time. We can actually bring a cube from the previous area to use as a staircase to get over the pipe wall. I would like the viewer to keep in mind that this is only possible because these are heavy cubes, as if they were any other cube, we would not be able to drop them without them exploding. We can use the cubes to both destroy the barrier behind the wall and as a staircase. Now the viewer might be wondering, I thought we couldn't use cubes as a staircase. Well, we can, as long as they're in the right situation. Using this corner right here, we can wedge the cube inside, allowing Wally to use it as a staircase. This is that example of a specific situation I mentioned earlier in the video, where the geometry of the environment is really important for whether or not cube staircases work. Now, moving on, we have a series of A presses that allows us to get the repair item. It takes 5 A presses to go all the way around. Time to save some. All of them. We need the repair item because we need 2 heavy cubes to weigh down this bucket. This causes the center island to rotate, allowing Wally to make it across. So if we could find another way to get 2 gray cubes, we could skip getting the repair item altogether. We can get those 2 gray cubes from the previous area. Because there's nothing stopping Wally from taking the 2 gray cubes from the previous area, after using them to get over this pipe wall, we can use the same 2 gray cubes to then weigh down this bucket. A little bit of history for you. Originally, I invented this trick for speedrunning and not even the A button challenge. Thanks to my speedrunning endeavors, we are able to skip all 5 A presses, leaving only these 2 A presses left in this half of the area. We then come to another strong cutscene. Thankfully this one doesn't require an A press to get out of. We then reach a dilemma at this blue box. It requires Wally to jump into it to move it, and we need to move it 4 times, yielding 4 A presses. We then jump onto this pad. Yes, that's what I'm calling it from now on. Which then flings us over here to this ledge. We then arrive at this cutscene, which is utterly unavoidable. The trigger that triggers the cutscene is huge and there is no way around it. There are also no objects or weird geometries in the area that will allow us to perform a glitch of any kind, so we must press A here. We can then take our electricity cubes next to the pylons, which allows us to take the elevator up and to the next area. This leaves Area 3 with 8 A presses. Thankfully Area 4, the giant tumblers, are much nicer. And I'll let you know right now, every A press in this area has been saved. First, we will simply leave both tumblers on their default side. Area 4 was designed to be more of a methodical puzzle area, with the gimmick of the sandstorm. The sandstorm can knock the cube out of Wally's hand if he's caught in it. This doesn't matter for us, we'll just pick it back up. Here, we were given a ramp we can use to get to this pylon without jumping. And there you have it, half the tumbler done. Now, you might remember this wall that required us to jump into it to knock it down. Well, we can actually just use this conveniently placed cube vending station to get a heavy cube, which we can throw at the wall to knock it down instead. The next A press was the one to get from the higher ledge down to the ending area. Wally has to make this pretty far jump to get there. Well, we can actually just fall back down and take the elevator back up, and use the elevator to get to the ending area. We then are faced with the final A press of the level, fittingly, a pipe jump. Now, this is a very short pipe wall, which will make things easier. However, there is nothing to work with in the surrounding area. No cubes, no trash piles, oh, I guess we could just do that. When we come to this corner, it allows Wally to jump over the pipe wall, thanks to the slightly raised ground underneath Wally. Now, don't worry, we are not jumping. This is an auto jump. You can see that the game just initiated an auto jump because of this symbol. This is because the ground behind the pipe wall is a slick surface, which is what caused the auto jump. This auto jump gets Wally over the pipe wall. What is probably happening is a small sliver of the slick surface is sticking out from under the pipe wall, allowing Wally to touch it, which causes the auto jump. And with that, we complete level 1, as well as the entirety of Area 4 without pressing the A button once.
Now, after a sweep of the entire level, it was time to go back and look more in depth on some of these A presses, and try to find ways around them. The next course of action is now to try and find a way to save this cutscene A press. Why this one specifically? Well, turns out I had unknowingly already saved it. In fact, I didn't even realize I had saved it until a few months ago writing the script for this video. The issue with this A press is that we need 2 cubes from this vending station. This vending station, of course, accompanying an A press cutscene. Over a deadly pit there are 2 bridges. However, in order to lower the bridges, their 2 respective targets must be hit with 2 cubes. Since there is a massive pit, there is no way around using these 2 bridges, which means there's no way around hitting these 2 targets. Logically, if we could somehow get 2 cubes without utilizing the vending station, we could progress without activating the cutscene, saving the A press. And there indeed does appear to be many cubes down here. If we take 3 cubes, which is the maximum amount Wally can hold, use one of them to activate the lift, this leaves us with 2 cubes, the 2 cubes we need to throw at the 2 targets. This allows us to bypass the vending station, saving the A press. I say that I had inadvertently discovered this because prior to the A button challenge, I had spedrun Wally. On screen now is footage of a Wally speedrun I performed. This trick saves time in the speedrun, and I initially forgot to count this as an A press because I subconsciously always perform the trick. Speaking of speedrunning tricks, there actually exists a trick to get from the start to the very end of the level within seconds. Okay, now hold on a second. How did we just go from the very start of the level
All the way to the very end? Well, recall the giant tumblers from Area 4. Yeah, these giant tumblers.
There are 2 giant tumblers, each with 3 sides. By completing one side of each tumbler, which is done by charging each side's respective pylon, this allows you to leave the level. However, if you go back and charge every single side's respective pylon, it unlocks a secret area. You can access the secret area by using the blue warp pipe at the end of the tumbler.
The 4 indicators above the warp pipe display how many of the 4 optional pylons you've charged.
This warp pipe to the secret area is not a one-way trip. If you instead use the warp pipe in the secret area, it brings you back to the end of the tumbler. However, the developers do not want you to use this warp pipe to skip the entire level. That's why they put this fence around here with a huge invisible wall behind it. However, by making this extremely precise jump right here, it allows you to bypass the fence. So despite the level technically being beatable in much less A presses than currently displayed, this video will focus on the no major skips aspect of level 1 ABC because tricks like this take all the fun out of it. Now, what about saving this cutscene A press? Now, many of you might be saying, oh, just go around it. Well, this is actually not an option. Attempting to go around it does not work because the cutscene's hitbox extends so far, no matter how far around it you attempt to go, it brings you right back. Even way up here, which is impossible to access without an A press, it still manages to bring you back. There appears to be a giant hitbox approximately this size preventing Wally from passing it. Now, let's move our attention to Area 3. Specifically, the A press is required to move this blue box. In order to move the blue box, Wally needs to jump into it 1, 2, 3, 4 times. However, the requirements to move a blue box are a bit more lenient. If you hit a blue box with a cube, it will then move. Now, this can be any kind of cube, including Wally himself. This means we can instead jump a single time and continue to hold the A button down to hit the blue box 4 times with a single A press. However, we can do one better.
By bringing along with us a heavy cube, we can take it all the way to the blue box.
We can then use the heavy cube to throw at the box, allowing us to move it the required 4 times without jumping a single time. This takes the blue box from requiring 4 A presses to requiring none at all. On the note of Area 2, the last remaining A press in this area is the one to jump into the tube. We've already attempted just running into it. Sadly, it just barely doesn't work, and I mean just barely. In fact, it comes so close to working that many of times Wally will just barely clip the ledge, allowing him to stay on for just a bit before falling off. However, it's so close that with just a bit of luck, you can actually make it in without jumping. And with that, our most basic strategy saves the day and allows us to save another A press.
This brings Area 2 down to 0 A presses, making it the second area that can be beaten without pressing A.
This A press would go down in history as one of the A button challenge's most signature A presses. How about this time we try to save this pipe jump? The reason that this A press was left alone until this point is because there is nothing in the surrounding area that will allow any of our basic strategies to work. While we do have access to heavy cubes, the pipe wall resembles the scenario shown on the left, and so the cubes would not be able to be used as a staircase to get Wally over the pipe wall. There aren't many objects that we can use in the surrounding area to act as a staircase either. However, there is one. While using the cube as a staircase would not work because Wally cannot get up the cube itself, we can use Hal the cockroach as an initial stepping stone to allow Wally to make it up onto the cube. In theory, an arrangement like this would allow Wally to get over the pipe wall. However, in order to do this, we would need a way to get the cockroach into position. As it turns out, you can actually throw an object at the cockroach to move it. By positioning a cube in the corner right here and having a cockroach in front of it, this could allow Wally to ascend the ramp. However, only one cube is not quite enough to get Wally over the pipe wall. As it turns out, the roach is not required to make it over the pipe wall. The corner along with the pipe wall act as the rightmost situation and do indeed allow Wally to use the cube as a staircase. And with that, we can now make it over this pipe wall without pressing A. Now how about this pipe jump? Could it be saved? There are 2 mounds of dirt on either side of the pipe wall. However, only one of them is climbable, and as mentioned before, the other one has an invisible wall preventing it from being useful. Using them to get this amount of height is unreasonable, and getting from here to here is also unreasonable. There is always the potential idea of using an explosion cube to blast Wally over the wall. However, it is still not known for certain if the explosion cube will provide the necessary height to do this. The explosion could also be used to get distance instead, and go from this rod to on top of the pipe wall. It's possible to use the trash pile to make it on top of the metal rod. Once on top of the metal rod, we utilize the explosion to go from here to there. A potential issue with this is that the corner could get in the way. After blasting Wally back, he could end up hitting this corner and not making it on top of the pipe wall. The solution would be to move Wally further down the metal rod. However, in doing so, we would then need to blast Wally even further, which may or may not be possible with the force of an explosion. Another issue is that the distance from the metal rod to the wall over here is pretty large, and there's no guarantee that the explosion from the explosion cube will be able to hit Wally from way over there. As mentioned before, there is an invisible wall preventing this trash pile from being useful.
There's nothing that can be of use over here, and this breakable barrier right here does not help either. We do have access to heavy cubes. However, again, the heavy cube wouldn't help here because we can't use heavy cubes as a staircase. So for the time being, this pipe jump still requires an A-press. Now how about saving that pipe jump earlier in the level? Unfortunately, it's a similar story with this pipe jump as well. The problem is there isn't anything in the area that can be used to get over the pipe wall. There's a charging station over here, a fence over here, and we could go back down over here. However, recall that in order to get to this area, it requires an explosion cube. Now there are actually 2 explosion cubes in the level. One right here, and one near the second pipe wall, up here, which, for whatever reason, decides to float off the ledge. Don't ask why this happens. I don't know why this happens. It's kind of funny while also being kind of creepy. I can't imagine what would be causing this. It just seems completely unexplained, but it's a thing that happens. Anyway, so technically it would be possible to make 2 trips to this area. There's also this platform over here. This platform can be activated by walking onto it from the higher level. Once activated, it will swing over to this area. You can get back on and swing back to the higher level. At this point it will be stopped and it won't move until you activate it again. This can't be used to help us get over the pipe wall because we would have to get over there first, which is not possible from this area. There's nothing to the left that can help, and as mentioned before, the pile of trash on the right can't help either. Now there is a box right here, however it is much too small to offer any meaningful height. On the bright side, it is possible for Wally to carry cubes over while getting knocked back by the blast, but then Wally can't put them down and so they can't be used anyway. Focusing our attention to these 2 cutscene A-presses, maybe there is a way to take them out the game. The problem with this cutscene A-press is even if you try and go around it, it'll still warp you back over. The cutscene, much like many others, has a huge activation trigger, and no matter which direction you go, you will always end up triggering the cutscene. After the cutscene ends, you can then throw a cube at this target. This will in turn trigger another non-A-press requiring cutscene. This begs the question, what if both cutscenes played simultaneously? Sadly, this cube is just out of reach. Trying to grab it would trigger the A-press cutscene. However, what if we bring the cube from the previous area? This would give us access to a cube, which we could then use and throw at the target prematurely. Now, this begs another question. How do we get the cube here? To get the cube way over there, we would need to first get it across this gap. And keep in mind, we can't throw or drop it. Recall that we can get Wally across the gap without jumping using the explosion cube. Notice how Wally can hold on to a couple cubes even while getting knocked back. We can then jump over the pipe wall, being careful to bring the cube along with us. This allows us to have a trash cube in this area and prematurely throw it at the target. Now the only question is, does it work? By prematurely triggering the second cutscene, it causes the game to glitch out. Wally can now move around as normal without pressing the A button to escape the cutscene. Interestingly enough, you can still see the game is waiting for Wally to press A to exit the cutscene. We can then have the next two cutscenes override the two cutscenes we just skipped, allowing us to be free and clear of both cutscenes without pressing the A button for either of them. You can actually see right here, for a brief moment, that one of the two cutscenes we skip tries to play, before it is quickly overwritten by the new one. Here's the second cutscene that we skipped. Notice it's the same one that we skipped earlier. Here's a visual to help better explain the sequence of events. The cutscene leads to an A press. After closing out this A press, you can pick up a cube. The action of picking up a cube triggers the next cutscene. You can then throw the cube at the target, triggering the van explosion cutscene. After the van explosion cutscene, you can make your way up to the higher level, where you will then encounter two more A press cutscenes. The circle represents the sequence of events. Notice that we have already used two A presses. After we wait for this cutscene to end and make it up to the higher level, we then need to use two more A presses. What the glitch does is it shifts the order of events. This shift allows us to overlap two of the A presses. First, throw the cube at the target while activating the first cutscene. This causes both of their sequence of events to happen at the same time. Notice we've already made it to the exploding van cutscene, which overrides the upper sequence. After we go up to the higher level, we press A, which is used to exit the two cutscenes at once, allowing us to knock out two birds with one stone. This then happens once again, allowing us to exit 4 A press cutscenes with only 2 A presses. Here's the entire trick in real time. Now how about trying to save the Heavy Cube introduction cutscene? The main issue here is that in order to activate the vending station, you have to watch the cutscene first. Looking around for potential solutions, there is this dead Wally right here. It has some cubes on it, however these are just decoration. There's the vending station right here, which we already have the repair item for. However, as mentioned before, we cannot use it unless we've watched the cutscene already. Inconveniently enough, we can actually stand directly on top of the vending station, however it just will not work. This is because it is only after we watch the cutscene that Wally puts the repair item into the vending station. After a lot of testing, there seems to be no way around this limitation. Moving on, what about the Heavy Cube bucket? Thankfully, 2 lights are already on, so we only need to activate one more. However, this is easier said than done. Despite their identical appearance, the explosion cubes cannot activate the bucket. Neither can a trash cube. We've even tried throwing Wally himself in there with no success. Not that getting Wally all the way up there would even be feasible in the first place. So there seems to be no way to activate the bucket via unintended means. What about attempting to bypass the bucket entirely? Well, we could do this by somehow getting past the gate, which is not possible because it's a massive, solid, immovable wall. Despite this, it has been attempted with no success. Taking a step back, another major issue is the fact that there's just not much to work with. We again have a roach, which doesn't seem to be able to do much, and we also have this charging station here, which would only be useful to drop trash cubes, aka not useful. There is also this secret path over here, which is blocked off by this barrier, but in theory, even if we were able to somehow get through this barrier, there's a huge gap here, and there isn't anything we can do in this area. Also, attempting to get either a trash cube or explosion cube to this area wouldn't be possible because Wally already has to have been carrying 3 cubes, which is the maximum amount of cubes Wally can carry at a time, and we need to use every single one of them to get to the area in the first place. And remember, we can't get more trash cubes from the vending station because using the vending station invokes an A press. So for the time being, this A press is going to have to stay for a while. How about we try and save the first cutscene A press? How about saving the last cutscene in the level, the one that introduces the player to charge cubes? The trigger seems unpassable. Even if you somehow manage to approach it from behind, it still triggers the cutscene. The trigger is about this big, so there's no way to just sneak by it. I feel like I'm repeating myself when I say that there just isn't anything to work with here. The entire ledge is completely empty, even over here. All we have is a checkpoint and an out-of-reach vending station. There are a few objects that could be helpful further along, but there is no way to get past the cutscene trigger to access them. Okay, how about we backtrack a bit to the 2 jumps on the center island. Let's go a bit faster. How about we take out this famous pair of A-presses? The problem with these is that there is again not much to work with, but our odds are a bit better. The gap is just a bit too large to make running over it feasible. We've tried before and... However, there is the idea of using the scrapped Wally to give us a bit of extra height. Ignoring the fact that we can't get on it in the first place, this has also been tried before and... There is obviously no height we could possibly muster up from anywhere around here except the scrap Wally, so this is also out the window. A staircase isn't feasible either because there is no backing. Any staircase objects would just get thrown off the cliff upon trying to use the staircase. How about blasting Wally over the gap? Well, we would first have to somehow not only get an explosion cube all the way through the level, which may or may not be possible in the first place, but we'd have to do it without pressing A as well. Also, to make matters worse, we are already using 1 explosion cube to save an A press, and we will likely use the other one to save the 5th pipe jump. To make matters even worse, Wally is already holding 3 cubes coming into Area 3, 2 for activating the bucket early, and 1 for blue box skip. All in all, it looks like these 2 jumps are here to stay. Specifically for the second jump, we do get access to this railing for height, if we could somehow get on it. However, this one has floors that drop out from under Wally, so we can't do a trick that requires Wally to be stationary. Heading back to the beginning of the level, what do you say we finally save this pipe jump? The problem is the lack of resources and lack of intricate geometry, as mentioned before. There's nothing to the left that can help. And as mentioned before, the pile of trash on the right can't help either. Now there is a box right here, however it is much too small to offer any meaningful height. If we look behind the pipe wall, we can see that there is a slick surface. We can tell because of the cube symbol at the bottom of the screen. Maybe we could potentially do something similar to the skip at the end of the level. However, there is no way that we could get close enough to the slick surface in this scenario to trigger the auto jump. Maybe we could potentially bring a tire all the way over to the pipe wall. Well, no. I don't have the footage of this, but I remember spending like an hour trying to get this to work with no success. I am permanently scarred from that experience. What if we could potentially get a cube over here? First, we would need to cross this gap with it. We already know that we can get over here with 2 cubes. However, keep in mind we need to use one of them to perform double cut later to save those 2 A presses. But we do have 1 more, so maybe it could be used somehow. 1 cube wouldn't provide enough height to get over the pipe wall, so potentially making a staircase of 3 cubes could be feasible. However, we only have access to 1 cube, so this wouldn't work. We already know that Wally gets stuck in the trash pile because he fills the gap, and even though we have a cube... Wait... What if potentially we were able to fill the gap with the cube, allowing Wally to now use the trash pile as a ramp? First, we would need a way to get the cube in there without throwing it, else it would explode. There we go, that looks about right. Now let's see if our theory was correct. Well, there you have it. There is still one problem. In order for this to work, the cubes had to be lying on the ground. We somehow need a way for Wally to drop the cubes, which is impossible without jumping or taking specific forms of damage. Despite the fact that it is very fortunate that the blast doesn't knock the cubes out of Wally's hands, it is also a curse because, well, it doesn't knock the cube out of Wally's hands. So now the question is, how could we possibly manage to have Wally drop his cubes when we have literally nothing to work with except, Oh! How oddly convenient we have this one charging station very conveniently being the only thing we have access to in this small area. It's convenient because this is one of the only ways in the game that Wally can drop his cubes on demand. Whenever Wally is getting power from it, he opens his solar panel, which causes him to drop any cubes he is holding. Also, how convenient it is that at this point after blasting Wally across the gap, we have taken damage, which means Wally can heal. Had Wally not have taken damage up to this point, we would have not been able to charge him at the charging station. I cannot overstate just how lucky it is that this is where the level designers decided to put the first charging station. Also, one of the only 2 in the entirety of Area 1. Now, there is only one more pipe jump. Throughout this long journey, we seem to have lost track of time. The challenge started in either July or August of 2022. Most A-Press saves were actually completed within the first day. Another large majority of the A-Press saves were found in the days following. As time went on, A-Press saves became more and more difficult to find. Subsequently, it took longer and longer to find them. During the first era, you had A-Press saves like Double Cut that were discovered. Recall that Double Cut and Area 3 Skip were speedrunning strats that weren't even accounted for when the challenge was first started. Probably the most famous A-Press save, Explosion Skip, was found during this time. This, along with other A-Button challenge defining skips, such as the first 2 pipe jumps, were found during this time. The famous Tube Skip was found during this time as well. However, the entire A-Button challenge wasn't just confined to the foundational era. A few other famous A-Press saves also took place outside. This includes some of the more unlikely and more involved A-Press saves, such as Pipe Jump Skips 3 and 4. Despite the fact that A-Press saves slowed down, this doesn't mean the work effort did. In fact, even more and more work was being put into the A-Button challenge during this time, and also more discoveries were made during this time as well. However, with A-Press saves happening less frequently, certain A-Presses were starting to normalize themselves. The first cutscene had cemented itself as that one hopeless cutscene that would never be saved. Double Cut was no longer cool anymore, it was just normal. The twin A-Presses were just a regular part of the A-Button challenge run. The bucket A-Press was probably the least significant one. I barely ever thought about it. A solution to Pipe Jump 5 still eluded discovery, however it was the next A-Press save in sight. Tube Skip was normalized, albeit a bit finicky to pull off. Area 3 Skip was subconscious, and the 2 jumps to and off the center island were the most basic A-Presses you could get. Blue Box Skip was just the normal way I thought about moving the blue box at this point. The jump onto the up pad was the next target for an A-Press save. And the Charge Cube introduction cutscene was the last but one of the most solid A-Presses of the bunch. Let's go back and try and save that first formidable cutscene again. Now, as you can see, it is difficult enough to get on top of this ledge with jumping, so it is most definitely impossible without jumping. But if there's one thing that the A-Button challenge has taught me, it's that the most useless discoveries can sometimes lead to meaningful improvements. So we'll try it. And of course, the cutscene didn't let us sneak past. What if the secret area could potentially get us past the cutscene? We know that at the cost of an A-Press we can get back there. Could there potentially be something of use back here that could let us get past the cutscene? If so, we could then try and save the jump to access the secret area early, which altogether saves the A-Press. Now, there are a lot of interesting geometries, objects, and physics-altering mechanics back here. However, they don't really offer a clear way of taking whatever it may be and getting its effect all the way over here to be of use to skip the cutscene. What's interesting is that over here, past these tires, If I can get past these tires without dying, genuinely these tires might be the most difficult obstacle in the entire level. Anyway, as I was saying, there is a vending station over here. Specifically, a charge cube vending station. This is a vending station just like the one next to the cutscene at the end of the level. Maybe, if by using the vending station at the secret area, we could glitch the cutscene at the end of the level, saving an A-press. In practice, an effect similar to the one that I just mentioned does occur. The only issue is that it is sort of doing this to the wrong cutscene. The cutscene it is playing is the one that is supposed to happen after you use the vending station at the end of the level, which in hindsight does make sense. Once again, options have completely ran dry. We're gonna have to let this first cutscene stay and move on to another A-press. How about the one to get from on top of the blue box to the ledge? Well, we would need to cross both of these gaps. Let's consult our basic strategies. I can tell you right now that going from here to here isn't possible. But notice how the blue box is slanted. Maybe leaping from the higher part would provide the necessary height to clear the gap. Well, with that very tight leap, we've just barely managed to make it onto the up pad. Now, you might notice that the up pad is not launching us. Yeah, that's the problem. Now we're stuck. You see, in order for the up pad to launch Wally, he must be in cube form, which means he must have jumped, which is what we're trying to avoid. So now we need to make it across this gap without the launch, which is nowhere near possible via just running. Yes, I've tried using this little stub to get a bit of extra height, but it's still nowhere near possible. This means jumping so that the up pad will activate is still our best bet, and the A-press will stay. Now there is the idea of blasting Wally across with an explosion cube, but let's be serious, this is far too outlandish for reasons I've already stated prior. The A-button challenge dormant, I moved on to other ventures. One of these is the level 1 max % A-button challenge. Now, this involves getting every collectible in the level, plus 30 wallop coins, one of which is up here. So being able to get on top of the Wally's home without pressing A would be great. Here is a wallop, and here is an example of a hidden collectible. Now, there are technically more than 30 wallops in the level. It's just that when you get 30, the game hides the rest and says you've gotten all of them. 30 is just the threshold. So if necessary, we could skip this one on the roof and get an extra one somewhere down the line. However, we can't just do this forever, so if it is possible to get this one here, it would be greatly beneficial further down the line. However, it doesn't appear to be possible to get on top of this roof. And believe me, I've tried a lot of potential strategies. I've tried bringing tires over, which was a massive pain and took a lot of time. I've managed to get inside this gap on the roof, but from here Wally sadly cannot make it out of the gap onto the roof. I believe I have even made it onto this tread before, just not the roof. Another interesting thing that Max % introduced was the need to visit all the tumblers. Sides A3, B3, and C1 can all be completed without pressing A. In fact, the only tumbler side that cannot be completed without pressing A is the second side of the second tumbler. Another challenge that I took on was the B button challenge. Now, the primary restriction of both the B button and the X plus left trigger button challenges are the fact that you can't use cubes. The X and left trigger button challenge prevents throwing cubes, while the B button challenge prevents picking them up. Because the B button is more quote-unquote popular, it ended up getting more attention. Here, a B press is required to get a cube from this garbage pile so we can throw it at the target. Now, there's seemingly no way to get Wally from here to here without using the Ferris wheel, and yes, this jump is impossible as well. The giant spinning tube in the middle doesn't help either. So, the question is, how do we get Wally from here to here without using the B button? What if, potentially, just hear me out, Wally could climb the Ferris wheel all the way around to the top and leap down the other side? Now, the question is, What on this platform could lend itself to be useful for getting Wally way on top of the Ferris wheel? Introducing the most famous skip of the B-Button Challenge, and also one of the most annoying tricks in the game, B-Button Skip. By meticulously climbing up the checkpoint, it allows Wally to just barely make this jump, which allows us to get on top of the Ferris wheel. Now boom, we made it over without pressing B. However, we now need to press B 3 times to get Wally across these platforms. Well, remember when I said for the A button challenge we could just not do the speedrunning trick and just play the level as intended so we didn't have to jump across these gaps to save 3 A presses? Well, this is the opposite. Here, we will use the speedrun route to save 3 B presses. However, the real problem is this mini tumbler. In order to move the glass wall out the way, we need to rotate the mini tumbler at least once. However, unfortunately, the only way to exit the tumbler is by pressing B. So what if from the Ferris wheel we were able to skip the entire half of the area? Well, introducing the other half of B-Button Skip. This trick skips the moving platforms and that pesky mini tumbler. Now this trick is more precise than it seems. There is actually a giant invisible wall here that we must carefully avoid. In fact, you can even see Wally pushing against the wall when we land after we jump.
Another B press that I tried to save at the time was the 2 required to weigh down this heavy cube bucket. I tried jumping into the bucket with the cube so that maybe I could use the same cube twice without re-grabbing it. However, this would just end up trapping Wally inside with no escape. The plan was after throwing one cube inside, we kick the cube so that it would bounce up ever so slightly, activating both cube requirements with a single cube.
But then, this happened. This was huge. If we could land on the other side, we could skip the 2 island A presses at the cost of 1 additional A press. This is a net gain of an A press save. All we had to do was get Wally thrown to this area over here. Now you might be wondering, where will we get the height from to get up onto this railing? Well, maybe if we built up speed, we could use the garbage pile as a ramp and leap up to the railing, and oh wow, that actually worked. From there, getting into position just requires patience and caution. Now, all we have to do is bring a single cube from area 2, which will be the cube we throw into the bucket, which will trigger the closing animation, which we will use to send Wally flying. Now the only question is, does it work? two of the most basic A presses were now gone. This launch, soon to be known as A button skip, will come to be known as the signature trick of the entire A button challenge, forever. Now, those of you paying attention may realize that if we fling Wally across the map, we no longer have a heavy cube to hit the blue box with. Well, what we can simply do is after getting launched by the heavy cube bucket, which requires us to jump in the first place, we can just hold the A button down to remain in cube form. And while we are in cube form, we can just use the original blue box skip and just push it around while in this cube form at no expense of an additional A press. Now how about we try and take this last pipe jump out of the game? Now let's focus our attention to this trash pile once again. Now I've said before that it's useless to us because there's a big invisible wall in the way. But what if somehow we could carry this height over here? What if we position some object here that would act as a bridge to allow us to use the height from the trash pile to get over the pipe wall? Some object like a cube. Now we do have access to the two cubes that we threw in the bucket. We can also bring along an extra just in case. Then we could throw the cubes right here and use them as a bridge to transfer the height from the trash pile to the pipe wall. Now this is much easier said than done, but I was determined, more than ever, to save the final trivial A press in the level. And around a half hour later, this happened. Now, I know that I just used this background music for a previous big moment, but this is a big moment too. This marked the day when every single pipe jump, some of the most defining jumps of the entire A button challenge, were now all passable without using the A button once. Now, this didn't mean a part of the A button challenge was lost, but forever preserved in the crazy, lucky, and awesome tricks that were required to beat them, arguably making them even more of a defining part of the A button challenge.
Despite just recently inventing A button skip, work was already being put in to save it. The end goal is to possibly one day get the entire level down to 0, so this A press would have to go eventually. Now the problem with this is that in order to save this one A press, we have to save 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 A presses. Now, many of you may be saying, no, we don't need to go around, we just need to save the island too, because we can skip the other 5 by just bringing cubes from the previous area to skip all of those. Well, yeah, at the time I forgot about that. The first A press here to try and save is these swinging platforms. There is a very large gap between the two platforms. Despite the fact that the platform Wally comes from is higher than the one he is leaping to, the gap is still much too large to cross by just running over it. If anything, this looked like it would be the most difficult gap to cross out of all 5 roundabout A presses. Now what about this one? Well, it turns out that this gap is clearable with our most basic strategy. Just run over it. Now what about this gap? Well, no. This one is not. It ends up being so close to being possible, but just barely not. This jump into the tube is just too far away to run across, and there is nothing notable to say about it. Coming out of the tube is an interesting situation. Much like the up pad A press a bit later in Area 3, this up pad can only be activated while Wally is in cube form. Here, we absolutely need the boost from the up pad to clear the large distance disparity. Here, we need the boost to gain the height to get over this wall. There is absolutely no way to get Wally this much height. which forces us to use the up pad, which forces Wally to be in cube form, which forces us to press A here no matter what. Or does it? Recall how certain surfaces make Wally jump. This is not an A press. Since the tube requires Wally to be in cube form, the game auto jumps Wally here. So what if we could use the game's jump and land on the up pad with that jump? The only issue is that the up pad is very far away. Since we didn't press the A button, we can't stay in cube form by holding A as we have historically done whenever we needed Wally to be in cube form for an extended period of time. This means that the moment we land on the ground, we have to have landed on the up pad. We cannot land on any of this surface. This is made more difficult because this is an upward slope, and you need to push the joystick way up with quite a bit of forward momentum to even get into the tube. This is a major problem because it means Wally is moving with momentum this way, but we need Wally to go this way as quickly as possible. This looks something like this. In fact, this was so restrictive that the strategy was thrown out for a long period of time before being revisited. However, that's when a new strategy was found that would allow this to come a bit closer to being possible. By angling Wally nearly parallel with the opening of the tube, it means Wally's facing angle is much closer to where he needs to face, and he can more quickly turn around now that he doesn't have to make a full 180-degree turn. With a lot of trial and error, the trick was eventually pulled off, marking the first instance of an auto jump contributing to the A button challenge. Now keep in mind, this doesn't actually help literally at all because I was just forgetting that this was irrelevant at the time, but it is cool to see that it works. Now the actual two A presses that would both need to be saved to save the A press for A button skip were the two on the island. Short story even shorter, nothing was found to save them. If you're saying that this was all completely useless, some of it would eventually turn out to be extremely useful. However, the immediate use cases for these discoveries relate to the most likely A press to be saved next, this up pad. We have just witnessed that it is possible to get the game to jump Wally for us, allowing us to use the up pad. What if we were able to apply that concept for this one? Again, just more tools that could potentially aid us in saving an A press. Right now, the only way to get Wally to auto jump in Area 3 is this tube, which is halfway across the map from the up pad. And if getting the auto jump from here to here was so difficult, getting it across the map was completely out of the question. But regardless, new tools and discoveries is what allows A presses to be saved, even if they at first appear irrelevant.
With all A press saves besides the one we just addressed looking impossible, things weren't looking too good for the A button challenge. So it was time to revisit the first cutscene. Now I booted up the game with the mentality of, if I keep trying to save A presses despite there being absolutely no hope, it would eventually happen. I just needed to keep at it, and somehow, some way I would eventually save one. So that's why, for whatever reason, I decided to take another stab at the first cutscene. To reiterate, this hitbox is so stupidly large that there is seriously just no way to sneak past it. At this point, I tried looking at more secret area strats. Yes, this is the secret area that already takes an A press to get to, but the fact that this is our best option just goes to show how desperate saving this cutscene is. We could try to use this area to go around the cutscene, but the fence is stopping that from happening, and sadly no matter how much we try, there's just no way to get over the fence and back to the other side. However, while I was playing around back here, I eventually got unalived by those pesky tires. Genuinely, these tires are probably the most difficult obstacle in the entire level. But this time that was a good thing, because this happened. By respawning at the checkpoint, the cutscene didn't play. This was huge because finally there was some light at the end of the tunnel. Some possibility, something we can aim for to finally save this A-Press. All we have to do to save the A-Press is activate the checkpoint, then scrap Wally and respawn with the cutscene skipped. Now, Wally has 10 power. What we need to do is find a way to lose all of it in this minimal space we were given. We have the area behind Wally's home, the beginning area, the area by the pipe jump, the area by the second pipe jump, this weird ramp thingy, and the slippery area by the checkpoint. Keep in mind, this is a slippery surface, not a slick surface. So to save the A-Press, all we need to do is take 10 damage, which I will track in the upper right corner of the screen. If this meter hits 0, we save an A-Press. Now to those of you who are saying, just scrap Wally in the secret area, remember, it takes an A-Press to get there, so using the secret area is not an option. What about this ramp area? Well, it doesn't provide enough height to cause Wally to take fall damage, so it's not going to be of any use to us. Also, this fall right here looks large, but it isn't enough to cause Wally to take fall damage. Now, if we could get up here, we could not only get access to the explosion cube, but we could also potentially use the height to take fall damage. Now, the explosion cube is really good because it deals 4 damage. However, it is not reusable. The height and the fall damage would only be 1, but it is infinitely repeatable. However, as you can see, it is difficult enough to get up there while pressing A. There would be no way to get up there without pressing A at least once or twice. Keep in mind, we are trying to save the one cutscene A press, which means that we cannot use the A button, else we will have no net gain. For a trick like A button skip, we can use one extra A press to save 2, because in the end, we still pressed A one less time. We don't have that luxury here, so we have to do this without pressing A a single time. One option would be to potentially utilize the explosion cube at the very beginning of the level to blast Wally up there, but this is completely impossible, and with that we've already exhausted all of our options. This explosion cube is just barely out of reach. I'll just say it right now. The beginning area and the area by the pipe jump are completely barren of hazards or high falls. Now, in the area behind Wally's home, there is an explosion cube, which we can throw at Wally to take 4 damage. However, there is one sliver of hope. If you can get on top of Wally's home, you can drive off and take fall damage. However, as seen before in max percent, this is very difficult to do, but now it's crucial. If this worked, this meant saving the most difficult A-Press in the game. The one A-Press that was thought to never be saved. So with that being said, I went on a grind. After spending around an hour, it was no use. There was just no way to get on top of the roof. On a side note, it is possible to get into this crevice here. However, it is barely not high enough to allow for Wally to take damage upon falling off. To make matters worse, there are also other issues that we have not addressed yet, like how we still need an explosion cube for explosion skip, a trash cube for pipe jump 3, and another trash cube for double cut. Now, while an explosion cube is easily accessible after respawning, the trash pile to get the 2 trash cubes is way back at the start of the level. This means after somehow scrapping Wally to save the A-Press, we would need to get all the way back to the start of the level without pressing A, and then back again without pressing A. However, if we break this into parts, we already know that we can get to the cutscene without pressing A a single time. Which means all we need to do is prove that it's possible to get back to the trash pile from the cutscene, and this issue is resolved. Now remember that ramp that we couldn't get up to without pressing A that we attempted to use to get past the cutscene? Well, here's the way the developers intended that path to be used. This long ramp leads to a secret collectible as well as an explosion cube. We can use this ramp and just walk off, which gets us back behind the second pipe wall. Now we just need to get back over the first pipe wall, which we can actually quite easily accomplish by just running off the higher section that accompanies the ramp area. Now back to the original problem. What if we made a giant cube staircase to get on top of the roof? The problem with this is that we have no way to drop the cubes without jumping, and there is no convenient charging station to save us this time. However, there is a convenient low ceiling nearby, which we can actually use to knock the cubes out of Wally's hands. Also, thankfully it is close to the spot where we need to take them, as we only have approximately 28 seconds before the cubes we dropped explode. Sadly, the surface geometries are so poorly equipped for this that a cube staircase would never even come close to working. At this point, all hope has seemed lost, but that's when this happened. Yeah, remember that explosion cube that's just out of reach, and how it has a tendency to float off the cliff to this area? Well, stupidly convenient glitch is here to save the day. Now, on the note of attempting this strategy by hand in a speedrun, this causes a problem. Only about 1 in 3 times will the explosion cube decide to magically float off the cliff. If it doesn't, it remains on top of the ramp inaccessible. This is no problem theory-wise, where all that matters is that it is technically possible. But if anyone ever attempted to do the A button challenge by hand, this means over half of their attempts would just be cut short by bad luck. My guess as to why this glitch occurs is it has something to do with this invisible wall. As you can see, Wally is floating, but not really. He is standing on an invisible wall. This invisible wall is here as you come up the ramp after respawning. The purpose of it seems to have something to do with the animation of the cones falling off the cliff that plays when Wally walks into the area. After this animation plays, the invisible wall has vanished. I would assume that the floating cube glitch has something to do with it being stuck inside the invisible wall, either that or some broken sequence of events that messes with the velocity of the cube when the animation is playing. Regardless, this allows us to take 4 more damage. But yet again, we hit a wall. There are no more explosion cubes in the level, no way to get onto the roof, and no more sources of damage in the area. And the cutscene A-press was so close to being saved. If only there was a way to take just 2 more damage. With that being said, the route was simple. Take 4 damage using the explosion cube, take an additional 2 from the weak cutscene, complete pipe jump 1 as normal, get the 1 in 3 chance that the explosion cube floats over, complete pipe jump 2 as normal, activate the save checkpoint, take the final 4 damage using the explosion cube to scrap Wally, and respawn past the cutscene. All without A being pressed a single time. After this, we can use the 2 ramps to get back to the trash pile and get an explosion cube. Perform pipe jumps 1 and 2 without pressing A again. And continue on with the run as if nothing had ever happened. Except something happened. We hadn't pressed A. We hadn't pressed A for the most formidable, impossible, strongest cutscene A-press in the game. Finally, against all odds, the first cutscene was now gone. But we're not done yet. At this point, it was time to revisit this A-press. It is a trivial jump, which is why it has been for a while believed to be the final A-press that will ever be saved. Recall that we can get on the up pad without an A-press. But from there is absolutely no way to get across this gap because the up pad doesn't launch Wally unless he is in cube form. Again, crazy strategies like potentially bringing an explosion cube from the start of the level
or using the tube to make Wally auto jump or something were considered, but both utterly impossible. However, let's talk about A-button skip. Prior to its conception, Explosion Skip was the signature trick in the A-button challenge. Before A-button skip quickly took that title, and is still to the present day, at the time of creating this video, the most signature and defining skip of the entire A-button challenge by far. Fittingly named A-button skip because of this. Well, if this trick wasn't already influential enough, it was about to put in even a bit more work. In theory, the fling from the heavy cube bucket animation easily provides enough height to make it all the way to the area with the electricity cube vending station, bypassing the up pad altogether. This on the surface seems like an obvious way to skip it if it weren't for the one major problem. This vending station requires a repair item. This repair item is located on top of the blue box. Normally this isn't an issue, but if we try to use the height from the fling to bypass the up pad, we end up skipping the repair item as well. There is no way to go back and retrieve it without just undoing the work, forcing us to use the up pad. Also, yes, I have verified that the game actually does check to make sure that the player has obtained the repair item before allowing Wally to get the cubes from the vending station. So the only way this strategy could potentially work is if we somehow were able to use the launch from the heavy cube bucket to get to the upper area while in the process grabbing the repair item. We cannot just launch Wally directly through it to the upper area because this is not how physics work. So what else could be done? Now, during some investigation where I tried launching over to the upper area just to see what would happen, sometimes Wally would bounce, and bounce considerably high at that. And with that, the following strategy was proposed. Fling Wally across the map using the regular A-button skip strategy, and have Wally land and bounce off the top of the blue box while collecting the repair item before using the height and distance from the bounce to make it up onto the higher area. And there you have it. Problem solved. If only it were that simple. Actually proving that this was possible required the trick to be performed by hand, as I do not have access to any tasking software. This trick was very difficult, and that is an understatement. Right now on screen is sped up footage of my attempts trying to pull off the trick. The reason this trick was so difficult stems from 6 different problems. First of all, after researching and using A-button skip so many times, I was very good at it. And by this point, I could pull it off about 1 in every 5 times. However, this was much more precise than A-button skip, because after getting flung across half the entire Area 3 with such high speed and somewhat unpredictable direction, you must then navigate Wally to hit this stupidly small target. When I say small, I mean really small. It was like trying to hit a needle in a haystack with a marble shot out of a cannon from really far away. Second, retrying the strat took around 30 seconds. Third, we had to actually collect the repair item, because technically we can bounce off the blue box and miss the repair item and we'd be screwed. This effectively made the target that we had to hit from, mind you, halfway across Area 3, an even smaller target. Fourth, Wally sometimes wouldn't bounce with the proper speed or direction or at all. The physics in Wally are very unpredictable at times, and so it was essentially luck that if after we actually make contact with the blue box, if we actually have a chance at getting up to the higher ledge. Fifth, because the fling is so difficult to control, almost all of the attempts were immediately failures because the trajectory was not compatible with the necessary speed and direction to perform the trick. 6, the path isn't even straight. There is a wall on the upper ledge that Wally could hit and bounce off if we just went straight. This means after bouncing off the blue box, collecting the repair item, getting the necessary luck to have the proper trajectory from that point, we have to turn Wally so that he'll miss the invisible wall. Also, we only have a fraction of a second to do this. All of this happens extremely fast and is extremely difficult to react to. Only about 1 in 50 attempts even hit the blue box. Not even all the attempts result in a fling. The main problem in the end was navigating Wally all the way across this huge gap at extremely high speeds to land and bounce on this minuscule spot. After 2 hours of non-stop attempts, this was the closest I got. It was close enough that I constituted it as an A-press save, but it wasn't technically proven. The trick was so unbelievably difficult that it was shelved for months before eventually I tried again, which is the footage playing right here. The footage of the 2 hours from the first session was lost to time. This is the long and boring footage from the second attempt session. This was a nightmare to attempt. This was a trick that required unbelievable precision. This, along with luck as well, this was the only way to skip the up pad. However, this felt unachievable. This, out of all the A-Press Challenge experiences, and out of all the speedruns I've done, and all the world records I've made, out of all the hundreds of hours I've spent on the game, this was the most difficult thing I've ever done in Wall-E, even till today. However, this would mean saving an A-Press. And this is Super A-Button Skip. After around 4 hours and hundreds of attempts, I finally pulled it off. Super A-Button Skip was now more than ever the face of the Xbox 360 Wall-E Level 1 A-Button Challenge. As a reminder, the route is as follows. Bring a heavy cube from Area 2, use it to make it over this pipe wall. Use the trash pile as a ramp to make it onto this railing. Carefully go along the railing to make it to this area, throw the cube into the bucket, and jump onto it during the animation to have the flap fling Wall-E across the map. Bounce off the blue box while collecting the repair item and land on the upper area. You may notice that this footage looks a bit weird. That is because the camera actually got stuck behind the flap because Wall-E physics. And there you have it. What a crazy, difficult, and signature trick. What better way to end the A-Button Challenge off than this? At this point, it's time to discuss the remaining 5 A-presses in the game and why they will likely never be saved. Now, here is a very difficult A-press for many reasons. This trigger appears to be approximately this big. There is absolutely no way around it, and we don't know how high it extends either. Because of this, there seems to be absolutely no way to get past it no matter what we do. The only way to get past it would be to glitch it somehow, and actually a discovery as new as 5 days ago on March 10th shows that it is possible to perform the double cut glitch here as well, which would indeed glitch the cutscene the same way as it glitches the others. However, this would mean that triggering this cutscene would still have to be an option, which it isn't, because to get past the previous 8 presses, we need to use the cutscene for the regular double cut strat. We currently use that cutscene to save 2 A-presses, so if we tried to use it for the aforementioned A-press, we then wouldn't have been able to use it prior to save the first 2. Another reason this doesn't work is because, how do we get way up here? Thanks to recent discoveries, we now know that it is possible to jump up onto the vans, and from there just barely get over this invisible wall, allowing us to not trigger the cutscene but still progress. However, this adds to the problems. Not only has the cutscene already been used, but in order to get up to this point in the first place, it requires 3 jumps, which is 3 times worse than just pressing A once. Let's just say that we are wildly optimistic and assume there is some way to save these 2 A-presses. Even then, there is almost certainly no way to save this one because of how unbelievably high it is, only barely being low enough that a perfectly timed jump can ascend it. Okay, let's be overly optimistic and say that an explosion cube can give enough upward speed to extend each and every jump. Well, we don't have 3 explosion cubes, so this is just not possible, especially since we are already using one to get across this gap. So with that being said, doing a replicate of double cut to skip this A press is out. It gets worse though. That double cut thingy is the best bet at skipping this cutscene, because like the first cutscene, there's just no way around it. And even worse, the cutscene takes up the entirety of this very tight passageway, so there is even less chance of getting around it. And to make things even worse, there is yet another continuity problem. Remember how the whole reason double cut even works in the first place is because we glitched the game into allowing us to move while having the cutscene active, which allows us to go just far enough to use a single A press for 2 cutscenes, and we do that twice? Well, none of that works if we end up saving this A press. Here, I have in the top row the 2 A presses that are skipped with double cut, which are these 2. Notice that the video on the right won't press A until after the lift. In the bottom row, I have the upper 2 cutscenes. Now, in theory, if we were able to save the A press I'm discussing, what would then happen is these 2 A presses would combine, but it would leave an A press by itself, still requiring us to press A twice to close out the second one. Now, this cutscene in particular is special. Here is the cutscene. Not this one. This one. Notice that this cutscene only triggers upon picking up or throwing, specifically, a trash cube. This means that the second A press can't be ignored because in order to get across the pool of death, we need to throw trash cubes which would activate the cutscene, which would force us to press A to end it. This actually applies to both cutscenes. If we tried to save the other one, we would end up with no net improvement because of that pesky cutscene. However, one more point about this A press before we discuss the other one. Remember this giant swinging hammer? Well, this is it up close, and it is possible to get Wally hit by it. Given proper movement, it is possible to get some height from it. Okay, that wasn't much. How about this? Now this could be useful. Now I don't have footage of it, but it is possible to get up on top of the hammer. Now after getting on top of the hammer, if there is a way to preserve the height, we could potentially go behind the cutscene. However, there is an invisible wall in the way. However, it may be enough height to get on top of the invisible wall. But all of this is just speculation. Now let's move on to the other twin A press. This cutscene activates only upon picking up the repair item. Now, you guessed it, the hitbox for this bad boy is stupidly big. Now you might be thinking, this looks passable, and you'd be right. You can easily jump over if you stay very close to the wall. Again, jump over. What if we could use an explosion cube to blast Wally over? This idea sounds good on paper, but in reality doesn't ever work. It has been attempted many times with no positive results. This A press seems like maybe in some fairy tale world where this explosion strat works could be saved, but for now things are looking grim. Also remember, even if we save it with this strategy, we would be faced with the challenge of not activating the second cutscene still on standby, which also seems impossible. Now, we can go around this cutscene no problem. The issue here is that we need a cube from the vending station, which won't give us cubes until we insert the repair item, which we can't do until we watch the cutscene. There actually isn't much to say about this A-Press. That's how hopeless it is. So many random things have been tried in hopes that maybe something will happen. However, nothing ever has. Now, let's say we brought a cube from the previous section to get past this barrier. We could then go over here, which is the path to a secret collectible, by the way, and maybe this could do something. But the path is covered in invisible walls, there is a gap preventing further traversal down the path, and the path ends up being absolutely useless. Right now, Wally scientists, me, are looking into potentially going out of bounds over here or something, which is just complete made up garbage, but it's all I got. The problem is that there's just no way to get a heavy cube because there just haven't been any up to this point. This vending station is the first one. So what if we found a way to get one without the vending station? Well, the only way that could happen is if we use the level skip, which, mind you, takes at least one A press and is a really bad jump to try to do without pressing A at that. However, this would take us to the end of the level, where we are met with even more problems. Because we haven't charged the pylons in the two halves of the giant tumbler, this gate is closed. And yes, it does have an invisible wall over it with some unknown height. There's still more problems. We would then need to go find a heavy cube. The closest one is here. Now, there are two problem points that we don't know if are possible. Getting back up this cliff, and getting past this wall from the other side. So with the route that currently requires an A-press, has an unpassable gate, has two major problem points, and everything doesn't matter because you probably can't bring the cubes through the warp pipes. Stay tuned because I find out the answer later in the video. Now, there is an up pad here that could aid us in getting back up this problem point, but we would need to be in cube form to use the up pad. Oh, I hate up pads. Sadly, this insane backtrack strat does not seem feasible at the moment. Now, what about throwing other types of cubes into the bucket? Tried it, doesn't work. And if we found a way to skip the bucket itself and get past the gate, we would then be completely screwed, because we need heavy cubes to get past pipe jump 4, this bucket and gate, and pipe jump 5. So we really need those heavy cubes. What's interesting is that this is actually a trivial A-press for cheat percent. You can see with a certain cheat activated, Wally can spawn cubes anytime, anywhere. What cube Wally gets is random, but it can even spawn explosion cubes. Skipping the cutscene was as easy as grabbing a heavy cube from the ether and boom, A-press saved. However, this A-press would have to stay for non-cheat percent runs for the foreseeable future, as this A-press cemented itself as the new most formidable A-press, taking the place of the first cutscene. Here is another A-press that is certain to never get saved. At the time, I still thought it saved 8 A-presses, which technically yes it did, I just forgot that the other strat saved 5 of those. However, if we wanted to save this A-press, we would first have to save these 3 A-presses. And absolutely none of them are even close to being saved. So Super A-button skip is going to have to stay. There is one idea that could potentially save this one. If we instead went around, bringing a trash cube with us to spin the middle of the island once we get there, we could bypass this one jump. We do already know that this jump here is doable without pressing A. Once we get here, we could then spin the island and only have to do these 2. But the problem with that is there is this massive gap that needs to be cleared first that requires an A-press. What if we were somehow able to bring an explosion cube here? Problem with that is we'd have to bring it all the way through the entire level. Not happening. Unless, maybe we tried. We have one cube left over, only one is being used for explosion skip. Now, I'm not going to show you the entire level again, but I will discuss notable parts. What about tube skip? Can we bring a cube through the tube? Demonstrated here with a trash cube, yes, you can indeed. You then just must be careful to guide the cube through the tube without it falling through a hole. Like that. We then grab 2 more heavy cubes to perform the old Area 3 skip, and can just barely carry the explosion cube plus 2 heavy cubes, which will allow us to get the explosion cube all the way to the swinging platforms. Now, I want the viewers to keep in mind, while it is in theory possible to get an explosion cube all the way over here without pressing A, it is hard. In fact, just getting this actual explosion cube here while pressing A purely for testing purposes took about an hour, so imagine how difficult it is without pressing A. Anyway, after a long, tiring amount of work, time for the moment of truth. Can this explosion get Wally across the gap? Yeah, so I kinda forgot my health was low and wasted the entire attempt. It was getting late and I wasn't about to spend another hour getting another explosion cube here, so I just called it a day. At least I had proven it was at least possible to get an explosion cube here. Now, there's one more I haven't gotten to, but I'd like to take a second to talk about which of these are most feasible. I think that the least likely A-presses to be saved are these two. The first twin A-press and the heavy cube bucket. I seriously doubt that Super A-button skip will ever be saved because it gets so much work done. And I have a bit of future insight, and it is about to theoretically get even more work done. If we're optimistic, the second twin A-press could in theory be saved. Now, as for the last cutscene, the one that introduces the player to electricity cubes, this one is the A-button challenge's last hope. But first, a few A-button challenge off-topics. To get to the ending area, it required the player to wait for the elevator and fall back down, recharge the elevator, and ride it back up. This long and tedious process was eventually made much quicker. You can actually just wait for the elevator to begin descending, and while it's descending, use it as a platform to run to the ending area. It's a bit tricky, but it is a much cleaner strategy altogether. It was also found that this pipe jump was clearable without using cones as a bridge. This is when JRunner took off in his speedrunning journey. In doing so, he discovered pause buffering. Armed with this new tool, he tried to perform the auto jump up pad strat. This took a bit, but eventually I got it. I don't have the footage of the first time, but here's the time I did it non-pause buffered. During the process of getting the explosion cube to the end of the level, armed with pause buffering, a new and more consistent strat was discovered. The strategy involved getting on top of the rail, then using the extra height to make it into the tube. This strategy was much easier to do by hand, which, speaking of, this is around the time when I did an A-button challenge run by hand. My route included 10 A-presses, 5 required, and 5 because the theoretical route was much too difficult to do. In fact, much of the footage from this video is from my 10 A-press run. I've just been cropping it. This is also around the time when the hyper-segmented run was created, which acted as a showcase of what the run would look like if it was real. It was created by editing together a bunch of little videos in one big continuous video. Recognize this footage? Also, around this time, a speed improvement was found for the twin A presses. Because the A presses are overlapped and always active, you can actually end the cutscenes early to go faster. Now, there is one more unsavable A press we have not discussed, but here's how it just might be saved. Now, several strategies were devised to save this A press. While there was certainly no way to get around the hitbox, other more involved ideas were theorized. If you'll notice here, there is a checkpoint right next to the cutscene. Maybe the same strategy used to save the first cutscene could be used here. Sadly, in practice, this doesn't actually work. How about scrapping Wally the same moment he activates the cutscene? In theory, this would mark the cutscene flag as watched, but end the cutscene when we respawn. There are two problems with that one. One, this has never been gotten to work because the timings are so precise. And two, Wally has been known to be invincible while watching cutscenes. Yeah, go figure, cutscenes are as unskippable as possible. However, there is some hope that this strategy could work. Another strategy dubbed Hyper A-button skip was theorized, which had Wally using the bucket to launch past the cutscene and somehow progress from there. There are a few problems with this. First of all, the elevator door is locked until you charge the two pylons, which you can't do without electricity cubes. So you have to use the vending station. Going back to use the vending station undoes everything that the skip accomplished, and even worse, we now have no repair item. So getting electricity cubes is out of the question. But how about not? Well, there seems to be no possible way to get past the elevator without charging the pylons. So if anything, this idea is worse. Interestingly enough, this A-press is saved in cheat %, because we can indeed launch Wally back here, and once we're there, we can just spawn an electricity oh my gosh. There. We can just spawn an electricity cube and charge the pylons, skipping the cutscene. However, this only works in cheat %, and so can't be used for regular A-button challenge. One day, JRunnerE was looking through YouTube and found a video uploaded on July 1st, 2008 by SPJ Glitches that showed this interesting trick. I was able to then access this area using A button skip, and in theory, this could skip the electricity cubes cutscene. This trick is called ultimate A button skip. Recognize this area? Probably not. It's this place right here, which is easily accessible via A button skip. From there, we can just go along the level behind the invisible walls and eventually make it to a recognizable place. Recognize it now? If not, hopefully this looks familiar. This is Area 4, the one with the giant tumblers. And this spot right here is this spot over there. Yeah, we are way off in a distance out of bounds of the tumbler. To reiterate, we use the fling to launch Wally out of bounds, and from there we walk along the level behind the invisible walls to get off in a distance from the tumbler. Here is a visual of where we are in respect to the tumbler. Here is a visual of the route. Now here's the question. How do we get back to the level after we've gotten past the cutscene and way over here? Well, what we can do is walk along the edge of the map all the way down Area 4, past both tumblers to near the end of the level. Here I say near the end of the level because this is where we get stuck. There are invisible walls completely encasing the ending section, which means there is no way to get to the actual end of the level, rendering the whole strategy useless. I've tried for around an hour to see if there is any way to get from this place to the end by walking off the world to hit the end trigger, clipping through a wall, jumping back onto the tumbler. Nothing works. With that, this promising strategy was shelved and left untouched for months. However, none of these semi-feasible strategies are the ones that make this the only savable A-press. Introducing Ultra A-button skip. Now there are 4 variations of Ultra A-button skip. The first one is Ultra A-button skip, Classical Variation A. See, here's the problem with just launching over the tower and going directly to the tumblers. This is not footage of it, but it's close enough. The problem is that the tumblers seem to not be loaded. On the attempt that I did manage to land on the tumbler, Wally went right through it. In many video games, what the game will do is unload certain objects that are too far away. Why waste computer power thinking about objects the player isn't anywhere close to? So if we want this strategy to work, we need the tumbler to be loaded. Based on educated guess, it would appear the loading zone is somewhere in the tower, most likely the elevator. So what if we just launch Wally straight into the elevator? Also, oftentimes in video games, if a certain geometry will never be touched by a player, developers, instead of wasting precious computer power, will just not give it collision. So if some crazy player like myself were to find a way to get to it, we could just go straight through. Now if you want footage of this in action, here's some right here from Ultimate A-button skip. With this being said, what are the odds that the game devs actually put a roof on the tower? Like, how in the world would the player manage to get up there? So the plan is simple. Launch Wally using A-button skip through the roof of the tower that likely doesn't have collision, land in the elevator and load the tumblers, and continue. So actually the main problem with that idea is the continue part. Because after doing this, we'd be stuck at the bottom of the tower with no electricity cube and no way to get out because we can't charge the pylon. Introducing Ultra A-button skip, Classical Variation B. Notice that in version A, we stay at the bottom of the tower, and in version B, we get out of the bottom of the tower. Now you might be saying, how? Remember how the reason Super A-button skip works is because Wally can bounce, and bounce especially high given a very high fall? So what if we launched Wally in such a way that he could then bounce up out of the elevator shaft? This never actually ended up working, as it was too difficult to even get Wally to fall through the roof, let alone lucky enough that he then bounces out. But turns out it was all for nothing, because I forgot that there's another pylon that needs to be charged and we still don't have an electricity cube. So this strategy didn't even work either. So, for the last time, introducing Ultra A button skip, classical variation C. If the ceiling isn't there, then what's stopping us from just bouncing right back out of the tower? The plan was simple. Launch Wally in such a way that he falls through the roof and bounces all the way back out of the entire building and lands right before the tumblers. In theory, this loads the tumblers by him going inside the elevator and allows him to still escape and continue on with the rest of the level. And that's where the A button challenge remained for months. At the time, the strategy was thought of as a hopeless pipe dream. What was once easy in theory, after becoming more demanding and after testing, had now become a strategy likely 3 times more difficult than Super A button skip, which, keep in mind, was a miracle that skip was even pulled off by hand in the first place. The strategy was believed to likely be possible, but there was definitely no way of knowing unless actually performed by hand. What if the roof did have collision? What if this didn't load the tumblers? What if the angle to get Wally to bounce out was geometrically impossible to achieve? In the end, the strategy was more or less shelved as a strategy I would have to wait until I got my hands on tassing tools or something, and likely wouldn't get a conclusive answer for years. It left Super A button skip as the final A press that would ever be saved. Weeks became months, months became over a year. Level 1 went from 33 A presses to 5 in the span of around 8 months. At this point, over a year has gone by without improvement. This cutscene had so many strategies that all had good chances of working for their own reasons, that this seems like it was still the potential last A press to ever be saved. However, as more and more months went on, I eventually accepted that level 1 may very well forever remain at 5. But if you thought that any of these strategies were potential A-press saves, then prepare to be convinced that this thing will be saved. Introducing a strategy more likely than every other strategy combined of working. Introducing the primary reason this was thought to be the last A-press to be saved. Introducing Ultra A button skip, modern variation. In theory, launching over the tower doesn't work because Wally falls right through the unloaded tumbler. However, there is a checkpoint, and the checkpoint might be loaded, because things like that developers like to always leave loaded. What's so good about a checkpoint, you might ask? Well, if we activate the checkpoint, we will then scrap Wally and should respawn in the tower with the glass broken, bypassing the need to charge the pylon with an electricity cube, and we can continue as normal. There's just 2 major hurdles. 1. Can we launch Wally in such a way that he perfectly goes right by the checkpoint and activates it? The checkpoint does have a really large trigger. Thankfully, a large trigger is a good thing for once. And it seems like it would be easy enough to hit it. Probably easier than Super A button skip. On screen now is footage of attempts at the trick, and about 2 hours total have been put in to try to hit this trick with some success. However, there seems to be a very big invisible wall jeopardizing the entire strategy, which I'm guessing looks sort of like this. In theory though, it shouldn't be too difficult to maneuver around, and so this hurdle is thought to be not that bad. Here is one of approximately 4 attempts that hit the wall but made it close. There is an invisible wall here stopping Wally from just walking to the checkpoint, but it's progress. It is believed that with just the right luck and good momentum, I can get around the invisible wall and activate the checkpoint. It's just a matter of time. Now, as for the second major hurdle, the checkpoint, like the tumbler, might just not be loaded. Now, I personally think it is, and here are just a few reasons why. We can just barely see it here, and also its upper display is on, possibly implying that it has some sort of operation. We see the same thing over here from the edge of Area 4. Here's a much better view. Also, in Wall-E, triggers tend to be loaded regardless of many circumstances. This is why level 6 skip works. Also note how this cutscene works even though it's supposed to play in Area 3. However, if that wasn't enough to convince you it's still loaded, take a look at this footage from Kane Plan uploaded on January 20th, 2025. Less than 2 months ago. If you don't already know, the Xbox 360 version of the game is different than the Wii version. In fact, every version is different than every version for every console basically, which is why I specified in the title that this is the Xbox 360 A-Button Challenge. On screen, one of the differences you can see is the graphics. You could also see Wall-E is flying. That's because this is debug mode. But you could also see that on the Wii version, there are no tumblers. No Area 4. The developers seemingly removed it to save space if I had to guess. However, they happened to leave in the recharging station and the checkpoint here. And guess what? That checkpoint is still loaded. Because the tumblers were removed, it implies that the developers sort of copy and pasted the Xbox 360 version onto Wii and deleted the tumblers but didn't delete the checkpoint. And if the checkpoint, which isn't even useful for this version of the game, is still loaded, why wouldn't it be loaded on the Xbox 360 version? This footage was the last nail in the coffin that firmly made me believe that this skip was indeed possible. Even to today, it's believed to be possible. However, it still has never been hit. On the note of other meaningless discoveries, because I was working on this video, I wanted to make sure that every possible thing I could want to include in this video was included in this video. Which led me to develop a new strat that I figured I would cover in this video. Introducing Ultra A-Button Skip's arch enemy, Anti-A-Button Skip. It is exactly what the name implies, Anti-A press, Anti-A-Button Skip. This is the strategy that attempts to skip A-Button Skip, saving an A press in the most basic way possible. Solve all 3 A presses in the first half of Area 3. Various strategy pipe dreams, like using the tube or the up pad to launch Wall-E all the way up to the heavy cube bucket, while having a heavy cube follow along to have it launch Wall-E without pressing A, because remember Wall-E needs to be in cube form for the launch to work, have been devised, but these are the pinnacle of pipe dreams. Now, don't get me wrong, Anti-A-Button Skip is still a pipe dream, but, well, yeah, it's just a bit more feasible of a pipe dream. The reason why Anti-A-Button Skip is the arch enemy of Ultra A-Button Skip is because these were the top 2 leading A-press save ideas. However, only one of them could work. Because Anti-A-Button Skip got rid of the bucket launch, you know, A-Button Skip, this meant Ultra A-Button Skip couldn't be done alongside Anti-A-Button Skip, because Ultra is rooted in that launch. It was this simple. Either Ultra is found to be possible and Anti is thrown out the window because it would no longer save any A presses, or Anti-A-Button Skip would obsolete Ultra A-Button Skip because it would then be reintroducing an A press to save an A press, resulting in no net gain. Anti-A-Button Skip saved the final jump A press, while Ultra A-Button Skip saved the electricity cube cutscene. Now, only one thing hadn't been tried yet up to this point to save this up pad A press individually, using an explosion cube. Now, there are 2 good reasons why this hasn't been tried. 1, this gap seems too far for an explosion cube blast to knock Wall-E all the way across. And 2, we would have to bring an explosion cube through the entire level and past the island. Now, remember how it takes anywhere from half an hour to an hour to get an explosion cube this far for testing? One slip up and I'd have to start all over. There was no way I was doing that for such a hopeless strategy like Anti-A-Button Skip, so I got an explosion cube here. Now, explosion cubes' explosions are wildly unpredictable, so even if this is possible, I might just not get the luck for it. The time was now. Moment of truth. Well, that worked. And with that, anti-A button skip was just barely any closer to working. In fact, this barely helped at all despite being a pretty cool video to watch. Yeah. What would really assist is if we found a way to save this A press. Last attempt using an explosion cube for this was embarrassing. So finally, several months later, we're trying again. Oh! Honestly, these two discoveries are just so cool that I'm gonna make you watch them one more time. Sadly, these awesome discoveries didn't mean anything because we only knew that we could get a single explosion cube here, not two. And this gap still wasn't clearable because there aren't 3 explosion cubes in the level. What would really assist though is if we could at least bring 2 explosion cubes here. However, explosion skip uses one of the explosion cubes, so we can't get 2. But what if we tried to resave the second most signature trick in the A button challenge? Well, it's been a while since I was trying to save this A press. Didn't think I would ever have to resave it. Remember how this gap is just barely not clearable with the most basic strategy? Well, what if we got just the smallest bit of height because it is already so close? What if we made a staircase to get just a bit of height which would allow us to barely run over the gap? Here's a tire. Jump on tire. We got tire from here. Now you can see I've already messed up once. Pushing physics objects around is an absolute nightmare. Yeah, also these death pits are like literal black holes and will aggressively suck in any physics objects that get close to them. So yeah, fun. Also, by the way, I found the footage of me taking a cone to try to save Pipe Jump 4. It wasn't fun. Well, there goes all that work. Anyway, back to that idea. Hey, it actually works. Now we just need a way to get onto the tire without jumping, and we just salvaged an explosion cube. So I'm going to take a second to talk about Super Mario 64 A-Button Challenge, which Bismuth made an excellent video on, and if you like this video so far, this one is far, far better, and the challenge is much more interesting. In a situation in the SM64 ABC, the team needed Mario to take damage because taking damage causes him to become invincible, but most importantly for their purposes, visually flicker. However, this flickering wore off too soon for Mario to make it to his destination. So what the team did was put a bunch of damage sources in a line so that Mario's flicker timer could be extended for longer. In the community, this is known as a hit-stun highway. If you want more information on hit-stun highways, check the link in the description to go to the video at 4 hours, 53 minutes, and 21 seconds. Now, how in the world does this relate to anti-A button skip? Well, enter the tire highway. The problem is we need to get height to get onto this tire. So by positioning a bunch of tires in a line like this, we can sort of transfer the height from this trash pile decoration to get to the tire at the end. This discovery was what is known now as height transfer by way of a highway. This particular highway is a tire highway. And there you have it. Explosion skip skip. With that being said, we now do indeed have 2 explosion cubes. An anti-A button skip was now in the lead for most likely A press save. Now we get to face a plethora of problems. Can we even get 2 explosion cubes here? We know we can get 1 to the start of Area 3, but what about 2 and 1 all the way over here? Instead of explaining why, I'm just going to say how. First, we fall down to drop the explosion cube. We then tediously nudge it back up the ramp and gently place it into position. After that is done first, we then build the tire highway. We then use the tire highway to transfer the height from the trash pile decoration over to the tire on the end, which gives us enough height to make it over the gap. We then use the charging station to drop our 3 cubes and perform pipe jump 3 skip. We then hope the cubes roll down the ramp and grab the trash cube to perform double cut. If you've managed to pick up the explosion cube at this point, like I have, use the slick surface to get the game to auto jump Wally, which will cause him to drop the cube. Go back up the ramp and use the very convenient swinging platform to get the other explosion cube, which we meticulously placed, while still being able to get back without jumping. Like, genuinely, I don't know why the developers put this here. It's completely useless, so I'm glad it's here. Now, a major issue is Wally's ability to only carry 3 cubes at a time. To get more cubes than that, we are going to have to kick some around. Thankfully, these trash cubes don't explode when left on the ground for too long, because that's how they came. So what we need to do is kick the explosion cube and the trash cube onto the lift. We can then use one of our trash cubes to activate the lift and pick up the other trash cube. We need to hurry and kick the other explosion cube off the lift before it goes back down. We then need to finish the execution of double cut before going back and retrieving the explosion cube. Here we need our hands to do pipe jump 4 skip, so we will have made sure that we have taken enough damage up to this point so we can use the charging station to drop the explosion cubes. Again, we don't have to worry about those despawning because explosion cubes don't despawn even when left on the ground. We watch the cutscene and get some heavy cubes. We then kick the explosion cubes over to the pipe wall to make the time window coming up a bit nicer. We then do pipe jump 4 skip. We then throw 2 heavy cubes over the pipe wall and pick up our explosion cubes. Now we need to move quickly because the first 3 heavy cubes of our staircase are going to explode soon if we don't hurry. We then quickly, one at a time, throw the 2 heavy cubes into the bucket. We then pick up each heavy cube one by one and throw them into place to perform pipe jump 5 skip. Now, we have proven that it is possible to get 1 explosion cube through Area 2. So what we do is we only bring 1 explosion cube through Area 2. We have to be sure not to pick up the explosion cube here due to a later part. After placing the explosion cube on the platform, you must grab 3 trash cubes, which will allow you to continue. After the hammer knocks the cube out of Wally's hands, you then must be sure to leave it on the ground for a later part. After lowering the ramp, you're going to want to slowly push the cube all the way to the plant cutscene, and it is really hard to get the cube down this ramp. Thankfully, this is all theoretical and never actually going to have to be done by hand. After this is all said and done, we watch the cutscene, which will remove the kill zone and allow Wally to go back down. And then go back down and do it all again. After picking up both explosion cubes, you then get a heavy cube from the dispenser and throw it over the pipe wall. Repeat this once more, and this time with the third heavy cube, you're going to want to use it to perform pipe jump 6 skip. Now you have to juggle 3 heavy cubes, all of which will explode if left on the ground for more than 58 seconds. So to get them to area 3, you must repeatedly pick them up and throw them. You then use 2 to weigh down the heavy cube bucket. And here is the convoluted part. Remember this blue box? Well, normally we either use the A press from A button skip to hit it along, or skip it entirely with super A button skip. We can't do that with anti A button skip. So the only way to hit the blue box is with a heavy cube. Now, over the swinging platforms, we have to bring certain cubes. We need our 2 explosion cubes, one for the swinging platforms, and one for the up pad. We also need a trash cube to spin the middle island once we get there. So how in the world do we get a heavy cube for the blue box over there as well? Simple, we take advantage of the long despawn timer, and a quirk special to heavy cubes. You can throw them without exploding. If we throw the heavy cube to the middle island, we can then hurry, do swing skip with 2 explosion cubes and 1 trash cube at hand, because remember, Wally can get knocked back by explosions without dropping his cubes. Then with 1 explosion cube and 1 trash cube, sorry my footage is messed up here, we then get to the island, throw the trash cube to spin the island, and pick up that heavy cube we threw on the island less than 58 seconds ago. Somehow get past this gap without pressing A. Yeah, there's a reason anti-A button skip is a pipe dream. Look at all the convoluted mess we've been discussing for the past 15 minutes for me just to tell you it still probably isn't even possible because this gap is still unpassable without pressing A. Use the heavy cube to push the blue box, get onto the up pad 0A presses with the explosion cube, and use it to blast Wally over the gap. Okay. Whew. Deep breath. With all that being said, the swing is passable without jumping via the blast from the explosion cube. The up pad is passable without jumping via the blast from the other explosion cube. We have access to 2 explosion cubes because of the tire highway, allowing us to not use one of the explosion cubes to get past this gap. And we just spent the last 10 minutes seeing how it is indeed just barely possible to get the explosion cubes as far as we need them through the level without pressing A, including the cool little heavy cube strat to get a heavy cube over to the blue box. With this being said, every problem had been solved, except one major problem. we still had absolutely no way to get past this gap without jumping. And this is an A press that has never been solved individually, only with the aid of A button skip, which we aren't doing. And sadly, as chance would have it, this gap turned out to be the one gap that would ruin everything. At this point, I had just assumed since the difficult A presses were solved, and since so many issues were resolved, that this trivial jump was going to be relatively easy to solve. However, in reality, this gap had only ever been crossed with A button skip, and for good reason. See, the gap is too far to just run across, and by a decent margin. And while the railing can get us some height, there's two problems. First is this triangle end, which means the high part of the railing is too far away to be useful. Second is getting onto the railing in the first place. How is Wally supposed to get up this height anyway? A cube staircase couldn't work, so what are our other options? Well, what if we use the triangle part as a ramp? Okay, now the question is, how do we do that without falling off? Remember, the floor falls out from under Wally in a couple seconds, and the rail is super thin. Regardless, I tried. And failed. But that's when I brought back an old friend. Pause buffering. And with that, we were on the railing in 0 A presses. Now the only problem is, how do we use the height from the railing when the high part was so far away from the gap? Time for another highway. What if in theory we could use a cube to transfer the height from the railing to make it over the gap? So I tried. And failed. Throwing the cube so that it would land in the exact right spot was stupidly difficult and finicky. However, I kept on trying, and trying, and trying, still failing. I knew that if this worked, this would mean saving an A press, the first one in over a year. And there it was. The cube, okay, that was close. The cube was in the perfect position. This was it. Wally at 4 A presses. Comes down to this moment. Well, that went terribly. Regardless, I pressed on, despite it looking completely hopeless. It seemed as though the cube wasn't high enough to get Wally over the gap. Or maybe it was just positioned slightly wrong. At some point it was so hopeless, I started trying to run over the gap. Until I got this good cube placement. Still very far off. But I would keep going. This had to work. Anti-A button skip was so close to actually working. This was almost 4 A presses. This was almost the culmination of over a year of discovery, bringing cubes through the whole level. Pause buffering. Explosion cube strats. Explosion skip skip and highway strats. Island 4A presses. Get to up pad 0A presses. The ancient blue box skip cube variation. However, this sadly wasn't working. At this point, out of desperation, stupid strategies were devised, like making a literal tower out of cubes so more height could be transferred. But getting one cube on the ground in the right place was difficult enough. This was borderline impossible. However, after so many attempts, I eventually had to rule this out as impossible. At this point, it seemed like the best bet would be using an explosion cube here, but that would mean sacrificing it somewhere else. The up pad gap was just way too large to not use an explosion cube. So this meant we would have to try to find a way to do the swinging platforms without it. With that being said, how do we clear a gap that is still stupidly big? Simple. We just run over it. Okay, just making sure that didn't slip by me somehow. Because it's not like that can happen. How about using the metal arm? Nope, no collision apparently. What if we used a cube to get us more height? We could get on it by leaping off the edge as the swing swings up to us. First, we had to test if it worked though. Where'd the cube go? Now, I know I already tried this, but just in case it slipped by somehow. Oh! This was actually really big. If only we could get from the sewage pipe to that other swing. Okay, well, this isn't working. What if from the sewage pipe we could get to the other sewage pipe, then onto the swinging platform? Well, that's a start. If this worked, it meant we could spare an explosion cube, and the A-press would likely be saved. We just needed one good run. And that was it. One of the largest gap A-presses was solved with pure movement and navigation. It was sketchy, but it worked. This called for a slight route change. We'd still have the heavy cube ready on the island, but we'd just carry over the 2 explosion cubes and trash cube, rather than using an explosion cube to get here. We'd then throw the trash cube at the target to spin the middle island, before grabbing the heavy cube. With 2 explosion cubes and 1 heavy cube, we would then blast Wally across the gap, and boom, A-press saved. It seemed easy, but I just couldn't get it to work. Because when you throw the cube here, it decides to explode over here. Now remember, it takes at least half an hour to get 1 explosion cube here for testing. So I wasn't about to, I brought another one. And another one. However, no matter what I did, it never worked. I'm going to be quiet and let past me emphasize the situation for a bit. This tightrope is so nerve-wracking. I think it's probably better to do something like this than like run. Oh, here we go. This again. Here it is, everyone. It's 2 o'clock in the morning at this point. Attempt number 4. So we had an hour to get to this point. I genuinely don't know what to do. Like, I'm just gonna throw it and hope that works. Pause buffering. It should. That's what we're hoping. Before this thing falls. I think this thing is gonna fall. I need to. Oh. GG's. Okay. Attempt number 5. I think we're on 5. I don't know. We've been doing this for like 2 hours. This thing. 3 hours total.
Attempt number 6. Oh gosh. Oh! That was close. That was almost GG's, bro. It should be possible. I just don't know if the angles are quite right. It's the only thing that's stopping it from just easily being possible. It's just the angles are all messed up. Bruh. Is it not instant explosion? I don't understand these cubes at all. Temp 7. Been at this for like 5 hours. This 1A press has taken probably 10 hours or so to save. Let's see what happens. Here we go. I'm so confused. Did I... What the heck happened? Attempt 8. Doing this. We're somewhere over 5 hours in. You know. I generally can't get on this wall. Attempt 9. I'm just beginning to lose hope.
It got late, and I eventually had to put the idea to rest. I knew it was probably possible, but wasn't completely sure. Maybe those surfaces aren't actually conducive to allow for a blast that would send Wally flying over the gap. At this point, I had started work on part 2 of the video and began putting all my free time into that. At this point right now in the video, I'm approximately 90 work hours into development, and an additional 20 hours of planning and other video-related activities. Months went by. Anti-A button skip, the trick that was just supposed to be in the video for completeness, ended up being so promising, despite how unachievable it appeared at first. Eventually I lost access to my TV, and it would stay that way for months. At this point, a year and 6 months had gone by with no improvement. The only improvement being Super A button skip was pulled off by hand 10 months ago. But it was already written off as possible months prior. By January 2nd, the video was posted to Discord, further proving the feasibility of Ultra A button skip. By late February, I had finished part 5 of this video, which included Super A button skip. By March 10th, I had the chance to get more footage, and it would likely be my last chance for weeks. It was 7 days ago. This is when I found this theory to be a thing. And on Monday, March 10th, 2025, armed with a new way to get explosion cubes to Area 3 without spending 15 minutes per attempt, I gave it one last go. But it didn't seem like the explosion cube could give enough distance. But come on, y'all didn't think I was gonna leave you hanging. And so there you have it. the complete history of how the Xbox 360 Wally Level 1 A button challenge went from 33 all the way down to 4 A presses, where the current count sits today on March 17th, 2025. All jumps have been completed without pressing A once. There is not a single instance in the level where Wally has to physically jump. The remaining 4 A presses come purely from cutscenes, which is just a testament to how detrimental cutscenes are to the A button challenge. Here is the route for the Area 3 portion of the 4 A press strategy. While that may be the current state of the Level 1 ABC, there are some advancements and potential ways that could save other A presses in the future. For instance, Level 1 Skip. If Level 1 Skip could be pulled off without pressing A, it could assist in the development of a lot of different strategies. The problem is, making it up this wall to precisely the correct spot without a jump seems completely impossible, given how difficult it is to do while jumping. The only strategy that could potentially work is using an explosion cube. However, there doesn't seem to be any way I will be doing this by hand with an explosion cube ever. A new idea for taking damage was theorized. By getting to the very top of the ramp here, it might provide enough height to take damage if Wally were to then fall all the way down here. However, after a lot of testing, this doesn't seem possible, and it might not even be high enough in the first place. Even more strategies were tried, but none of them worked. The original luck-based strategy for skipping the first cutscene would have to stay for real-time ABC runs. While off of the new save file, one wouldn't be able to enter the warp pipe. Work was still being put in to enter it in 0 A presses. However, it was a bit too high for a tire to get Wally up into it. So introducing the latest development in tire highway engineering, the Tire Highway Staircase Hybrid. Equipped with a double stacked tire on the end of a 7 tire long highway, this little contraption allows Wally to get into the warp pipe without pressing A. This is not the only use case of a highway. A highway was also found to make getting into this warp pipe possible, potentially allowing Level 1 to technically be beaten in a single A press. I am just not sure if this slope is climbable without an A press because of this trigger nearby. It was found you can use the tires on top of these vans to make a tire highway, which allows you to get into the warp pipe. On the note of potential A-press specific strategies, here are the current ideas for saving the remaining A-presses. First of all, elect cutscene. This one looks extremely grim now because of anti-A button skip, obsoleting the bucket launch. Since Ultra A button skip is no longer an option, sort of, this means that we are now left to only one potential way to save this A-press. If Wally were to take damage and become scrapped the instant he activated the cutscene trigger,
This would potentially activate the cutscene, but cause Wally to respawn. This would in turn end the cutscene without us having to press A, and we could continue on. However, in the few trials I did, it appears as though Wally may be invincible, so chances are looking a bit grim. Also, if this were to work, there is a very strong chance that we lose our repair item from the death, forcing us to go back and retrieve it, which means we would not only need to use the A button to move the blue box, but also press A to use the up pad. And it's not like we can go back through the level because this gap isn't crossable without an explosion cube, which we don't have now that we respawned. Also, even if we were able to somehow get back to the beginning of the level and grab a heavy cube along the way to do blue box and 0 A presses, we would still have to press A to use the up pad, because guess what? After respawning so far away, the explosion cubes don't respawn with you, so all the explosion cubes are gone at this point, and so are our chances at saving this A press. But wait, there's more! Reason why this won't be saved. If it takes 2 explosion cubes to get here, how would we take damage at the cutscene with, well, no way to take damage? Well, we would need to use an electricity cube. No, not from here, but from the secret area. You heard that right. The only way we could potentially save this A press is by doing level 1 skip without pressing A to access the secret area. This is why I say figuring this out would be very beneficial. Now, I already told you how it might not work, how we wouldn't have the repair item, and if we went back to get it, we couldn't get back up due to many issues, and how we would somehow need to perform level 1 skip without pressing A. But it gets worse. Now somehow we have to bring an electricity cube and 2 explosion cubes through the entire level, which may or may not be possible, especially considering that we now no longer have an extra cube to spare in our hands. Also, the electricity cube cannot be left on the ground for more than 6.3 seconds, which probably immediately makes it impossible to get it past the tube in Area 2. And somehow we need to get all 3 cubes through Area 3, which as we saw was already just barely possible. But what I will say is if you thought any of the routing for bringing 2 cubes through the whole level was insane and confusing, just the route to get 2 explosion cubes and an electricity cube through Area 3 is more complicated, tightly timed, and insane than the entire route combined. So that's how we would save this A press. For Epitome, well, honestly it isn't even looking that bad considering this is the modern day boss fight of the A button challenge. It actually may be the easiest. Currently only one strategy exists to save it. Do level 1 skip without pressing A. See why we need to do this thing without pressing A? We would then use the warp pipe to get to the end of the level and win. Hold up, no. You didn't think we were gonna go to the end of the level to win now, did you? No, we are going to go to the end of the level to get that heavy cube I mentioned earlier in the video. The heavy cube at the end of the level is literally the closest heavy cube we have access to. But again, there's a massive invisible wall in the way, no way to get back through the warp pipe, no way to get up this cliff, or knock over this wall from the backside. And we can't even bring cubes through the warp pipe, so it's all for nothing anyway. In fact, if anything, this is the most detrimental problem. If there's no way to bring the cube through the warp pipe, it's all for no- oh! Wait, Wally can bring a cube through the warp pipe? Okay, great, glad I found that out only a week ago. Regardless, there's still a plethora of reasons why this can't work, and this is the strategy to save this A press. Now there are the twin A presses. Now, I'm going to begin off morbid. There is basically no strategy to save the first of the twin A presses. Like, literally nothing. The only hopes we have is using the double cut glitch, except that is already used by the previous 2 A presses, so those would have to be resolved. Even then, there is no way to get up possibly the highest possible jump Wally can even jump up to perform twin cut. Also, there's potentially using this hammer to get on top of this hammer to then, I don't know, do something up there. So that's how we are saving that A press, not really, but one can dream. Now as for the other twin A press, originally the last 5 A presses were thought of as unsavable, especially Super A button skip. But here we are today. And because in the A button challenge, the odds are always defied, the A presses we thought were unsavable the bosses of the ABC beaten, it has changed me, and now I am able to hold hope that maybe these actually will be saved, and the second twin A press is the primary target. Since it is possible to jump over the trigger that causes Wally to grab the repair item, it seems like there should be a way to blast Wally over the repair item. This has two issues. One, the cutscene that we had on standby is probably going to stop us in our tracks the moment we try to progress. And second, we're already using both explosion cubes. This is why I said Ultra A button skip is sort of obsoleted. If there is a way to blast Wally over the repair item, this would lose an explosion cube, thereby making anti-A button skip impossible. Kinda. If we do anti, the run is 4 A presses, but if we do the twin skip, the run will still end up being 4 A presses. Since twin skip requires an explosion cube, this means we can no longer do A button skip, and we would have to go back and use super A button skip, reintroducing a jump A press. But that's the thing, we have to go back to the launch. So if we combined both the blast over the repair item, twin skip, and Ultra A button skip, this would lower the count to 3 A presses. Ultra is still believed to be possible, so if someone can prove that the blast over the repair item is possible without the other cutscene from Double Cut popping up, that's basically an A press saved. Now there is the other strategy to save the second twin A press. If Wally were to scrap, he would respawn here, which does nothing. But if Wally were to get blasted back by the explosion as seen here, and fly through the repair item, triggering the cutscene, then go so far that he activates the checkpoint, which has its trigger right here, then with just enough momentum from the knockback, he slides off the edge into the death pit. He will slowly take damage until he scraps and will respawn past the repair item. Remember that cutscene on standby from Double Cut? That will have been sort of deleted from standby, and so we're home free. Except now we're stuck here as we have no way to continue because the bridge isn't lowered. Which means we would have to go back and get a trash cube, which would cause us to grab the repair item again, because the repair item also respawns. Here's some footage of my attempts at this trick. Here I activated the checkpoint, so I even tried quitting out the level and used the continue feature to get back to this checkpoint. However, there was no way to actually quit the game without pressing A. However, these two variations of twin skip are the ways that this A press could potentially be saved. And that's it. These are the last hopes of the A button challenge. 4 A presses, one with promising potential to be saved. So many insane strategies and cool glitches were used to get the level from 33 all the way to only 4 A presses. So many formidable foes overcame. So many clever uses of objects and physics. However, this is not the end. Endless research will go into level 1 and maybe one day lower the count. And there are other categories like B button challenge, A button challenge max percent, and the entire rest of the game just waiting to be brought into the interesting complexity of the ABC. This is the result of hundreds of hours of planning, thinking, and grinding. This is one of the biggest projects of my life. This is very well one of the coolest freaking things I've ever seen. This isn't the end. This is the history of the Wally Level 1 A button challenge. Thanks for watching.